A demon appeared at our army barracks. The higher-ranking officers were off enjoying themselves, leaving the lower-ranked soldiers to handle it alone. Even though it was a lower-class demon, it still struck fear into everyone present. One soldier was eliminated in a single hit. Before it could take any more lives, I stepped forward. I swung my blade with everything I had, but only managed to land a single clash. Standing there, I was afraid too. I was supposed to be a transcendent hero, destined to bring down the Demon King. Yet here I was, terrified of a lower-class demon. It all started with what became known as the Day of Reversal, an event that left a trail of chaos and destruction in its wake. From that point forward, the world was pulled into a 100-year war against the demon race, one that plunged every kingdom into complete darkness for generations. The losses were staggering: 290,000 dead from the Federation alone, and 4.8 million civilian casualties. By the time the demon army advanced to humanity's last line of defense, they had also set their sights on the pass of Jukun Mountain, a sacred site. With that, defeat felt almost certain. Yet despite everything, life for the soldiers continued. Someone struck me hard across the face. I heard the word transcendent and answered immediately. They hit me again. I lifted my head and answered a second time. Then they asked whether transcendents were discharged from service. I told them no. They informed me that there were people waiting to destroy me, and that starting the following morning I was to drink water, keep my armor on at all times, and never sleep, because if I did, I would not survive. Every morning, without exception, I was to gather everyone at the training grounds. I told them I understood. The following morning, the camp's flag moved in the wind as a new day began. I woke up suddenly inside my tent, gripped by something I could not immediately place. A soldier entered and called my name Gate. It was then that I understood. I had been dreaming about my early days, and the memory left me irritated. I pushed it aside and got to my feet, sword already in hand, and asked who had been on watch the night before. An elven archer named Scully answered. She told me it was Morris from the 2nd magic class, and that a dwarf named Manhwa had caused a commotion early in the morning looking for me, waking the entire camp. The problem was that the noise had drawn the attention of the higher-ranking officers, who had little tolerance for disorder. Scully warned me that even if she let it go, they would not. I told Morris directly that he needed to reflect on what he had done, and that I would not be covering for him again. I shifted the conversation and asked Scully for the day's enlistment roster. She mentioned that according to scripture, this new group might include a transcendent. She went on to explain that on Jukun Mountain stood 10 legendary weapons known as the Deca weapons. Anyone who managed to draw one of those weapons from the mountain was classified as a transcendent. And according to the prophecy of the great prophet Streetbind, when 10 transcendents finally gathered together, they would have the power to defeat the demon lord. Back in the present, I complained to Scully about being assigned to evaluate the black magic division. I was a swordsman, it made little sense. She reminded me that only 2 transcendents had emerged so far, myself and the mage Morris, and that she believed the prophecy would hold. She asked me to treat the next chosen one well when they appeared. We briefly spoke about squad leader Uldring, who carried a well-known inferiority complex, and then turned our thoughts to the Black Dragon Demon Lord. The hope was that this brutal war would finally reach its end. The rewards for being a transcendent were considerable, triple the pay, and even a statue bearing your likeness. Scully then brought up a rumor that the brigade might be dissolved if there was one more deserter. I smiled and told her I was not the one who chose the transcendent. That was the weapon's decision. What mattered more was the territorial battle ahead, because losing it would mean everything was over. Before we could continue, Scully and I both noticed that the high-ranking officer Uldring had arrived earlier than expected. We saluted without hesitation. Uldring was a high-ranking black mage of the Dark Elf race, and his presence already put me on edge. I set that aside and moved forward with the selection. Lined up before us were volunteers from the Black Magic Division, a large crowd, all of them visibly anxious. I studied them. Given that these were black magic volunteers, I had already expected to find some unsavory individuals among them, and a few faces confirmed exactly that. I stepped forward and called for their attention. Their response was weak, and I told them to put twice the force behind it. When they still fell short, I asked how many times I needed to say it. Finally, they responded the way soldiers were supposed to. Satisfied, I explained that one of them would become a transcendent and remain in the unit, and that even those not chosen would be placed in significant positions throughout the army. I then called up recruit number 7 Swan, top of the class, and told her she looked apathetic. During the evaluation, I was caught off guard by the eyes of recruit number 29, Xenia. I moved on and noticed recruit number 13, Nartz Windsor, the only son of a wealthy family. The Beckenberg family was known for their immense fortune and exceptionally valuable jewels, a noble house of dark elves with a strong paternal heritage. Nartz wore so many expensive rings that his fingers had turned purple. The spoiled upbringing was impossible to miss. I stepped forward and formally introduced myself as their instructor. I told them I was a transcendent and the guide for the special task force they were about to join. The recruits reacted with visible shock, their eyes moving to the sword on my back, wondering if it was one of the Deca weapons. The scene shifted to Morris, a gnome and fellow transcendent, who looked genuinely frightened of something. He was with the recruits, taking down uniform sizes for exchange, when he froze at the sight of recruit number 13, requesting a full exchange of everything. He recognized immediately that it was Nartz Windsor, one of the troublemakers Scully had warned me about. The stress written across Morris's face was plain to see. I watched him from a distance and thought to myself that the problem recruits always made themselves known early. I planned to deal with them soon enough. At that moment, Uldring approached and called my name with. He informed me that he would personally escort the new recruits to their barracks. Scully leaned over and whispered that she suspected he was looking to confiscate something. I told her to act as though she had not noticed. She said her goodbyes, mentioned she needed to sleep, and I dismissed her. Alone with Morris, I could see something was wrong. He was trembling. I walked over and asked him what the matter was. Someone came down hard on Morris. It was Jaga, a high-ranking knight from the Federation Central Company. He kept stomping on him, remarking casually that he had slept well the night before thanks to Morris. Morris lay on the ground, unable to say a word. I told Jaga quickly that if he continued, Morris would die. He told me he would not. Then he looked down at Morris and asked why he was not getting up. Morris forced himself to his feet. Jaga laughed and said that was proof he was perfectly fine, then came down on Morris again, harder this time. I moved to stop him. Jaga turned on me immediately, furious, asking whether I was talking back to him. I paused. He asked me if I wanted another scar on my face. I had no answer. I stayed silent. The prophecy from the scripture remained vague, still largely a mystery to those who studied it. The wait had stretched on for years, until finally 2 soldiers pulled Deca weapons from Jukun Mountain, myself and Morris. We became the unit's transcendents. Even so, many soldiers dismissed the prophecy entirely, treating it as nothing more than a legend. In the middle of a war this brutal, the balance of power was fragile, held together only by hierarchy and the strength of whoever stood at the top. With so many different species serving in the same army, order had to be enforced with an iron hand. To many, the idea of a transcendent was nothing but bait, a myth used to keep everyone in line. Jaga looked at me and asked whether I was protecting the gnome, simply because we were both transcendents. He repeated my words back at me, asking if I really wanted to give him another scar. I did not move. I kept my eyes on him and held my ground. The 2 of us stood there, locked in silence. Then Scully appeared, calling out Jaga's name with urgency in her voice. Her arrival cut through what was about to happen. Jaga turned, visibly irritated, and asked what she wanted. She told him that an officer was calling the knights in for an important meeting. He muttered something about missing spears, then said he would meet them at the barracks, and walked off. On his way out, he shoved past Scully and told her to get out of his path. Scully turned to me and asked what had happened. I told her Jaga had always been difficult. I walked over to Morris, who insisted he was fine, saying he had used a defense spell in time. That only made me angrier. Jaga had gone out of his way just to harass him. Scully quickly pointed out that Jaga likely also had his eye on Nartz, the wealthy recruit. I warned Morris to stay alert, reminding him that Jaga's behavior came from a deep inferiority complex. I told him to use his head rather than simply apologizing every time. As we walked, I asked Morris why he needed to use the bathroom so frequently. The answer, as I had read somewhere, was straightforward. Gnomes had a metabolism faster than humans, and according to recorded documentation, 95% of them were lactose intolerant. I picked up a report and found myself wondering whether Morris had woken Scully up just to send her on an errand. I told the 2 of them to sort out the mess themselves. I had to get to headquarters. Over in the recruit barracks, the tension was immediate. Recruit number 29, Xenia, sat beside recruit Swan, with an unusual look fixed on her face. The 2 were locked in silence, staring at each other. Swan was already asking herself what this girl's problem was. On the other side of it, Xenia was equally unsettled, finding Swan's gaze impossible to sit with. Then Uldring entered the tent carrying a bag, pulling everyone's attention to him. He held up confiscated tobacco. Swan looked at him and thought he reminded her of someone who had once tried to court her. The memory took her back to peacetime, outside a bar. Inside, Two girls were mid-conversation, one of them mentioning that her friend had ended a relationship over a dwarf. Then, an elf bearing a striking resemblance to Oldring approached Swan's table and greeted her. He and a friend made their move, inviting the two of them to join them. Swan shut it down immediately, telling them they were in the middle of something. The two men did not give up, offering to come back in 5 minutes. After they left, her friend asked why she had turned them down. Swan said simply that she was not interested in lean men. She preferred someone more solid. Back in the present, she thought quietly about how those had been better days. Oldring then announced that before training began, everyone would be receiving a tetanus shot. Swan was caught off guard and wondered silently why healers were not simply used instead. He ignored the atmosphere in the room, ordered everyone to maintain discipline until the instructor arrived, and left. The recruits sat in silence. Swan thought about how strange and suffocating the whole situation felt. Then one of the recruits started complaining about Oldring's attitude. Swan told him to be quiet. Another soldier immediately told the same recruit to fix his posture and called him an idiot. The recruit took offense and challenged him to a fight on the spot. Swan grew more irritated watching the scene unfold. Then I walked in holding a stack of papers. The tent went silent instantly. Every recruit in the room recognized who was standing in front of them. Even Swan felt something tighten in her chest at my presence. Across the tent, recruit number 13, Narts, sniffed at something and told whoever was beside him to watch where they were putting their hands. Swan gets irritated because the guy has a look of disgust that would push anyone away. She then moves away thinking he's a total scumbag in every possible way. Meanwhile, Gate looks at the exchange requests and sees they are all from one person. NZ then stands up and proudly says that the exchange requests are his. He starts making an excuse about his family's fortune and color tones. Our hero cuts him off and tells him to cut the crap and just wear the uniform. With a smirk, Narts tries to send one of the other recruits in his place. Our hero then asks what he's doing and tells the guy to get in line. The rich recruit starts to have a meltdown, repeating our protagonist's words. Suddenly, N snaps and yells not to play mind games with him. Gate just watches the scene with a sour face and zero patience. The situation makes all the other recruits in the tent very uncomfortable. The recruits were completely lost, none of them understanding what had just been said. Swan had reached her limit. She cursed under her breath, fed up with the entire situation. I saw enough and ordered everyone down for push-ups. They dropped into position immediately. I told them I would let it go this time, but made it clear that next time, I would make their lives considerably worse. They shouted back their acknowledgement in unison. Narts, however, was already struggling. The position was clearly beyond anything he had been prepared for. The spoiled upbringing showed. The following day, the recruits were lined up to receive their tetanus shots. Scully moved down the line administering the injections. One recruit asked why an archer was doing this. Beside me, Morris quietly asked whether the shot was truly necessary. I told him about Dranine, a healer who lost part of her leg to a goblin wound that had been treated incorrectly. I explained that tetanus was just as capable of killing a soldier as any weapon on the battlefield. Morris went pale. I added that not even the great archmage Vilcross had been able to overcome it. I allowed myself a small smile at that. Then I heard shouting from the direction of the recruits. I asked Scully, who was already rushing toward me, what had happened. She told me that recruit number 13 had vanished from the line. The news hit me hard. Narts' face came back to me immediately, and I cursed him for running. Scully explained that Jaga had escorted the recruits and told them to begin the injections without doing a head count first. The fault was his. I asked if anyone had seen which direction Narts had gone. Recruit Xenia raised her hand. She told me her special ability was Eagle Eye. I asked her to use it. She scanned the distance and pointed toward the mountain, saying he was heading that way at that very moment. Scully and Morris exchanged confused looks. That was the mountain behind the camp. I understood immediately. That was where the Deca weapons were. Meanwhile, Narts walked alone, fully convinced he was the one the prophecy had chosen. He arrived at the Jukun mountain pass carrying himself with an air of complete superiority. When he found a magic staff there, he was certain it had been placed there for him specifically. The memory of his argument over the uniform came back to me. The boy was simply an idiot. On top of everything, the other recruits were already humiliated, voicing their frustration over the mockery they had been made to endure. Back at the mountain, Narts stood smiling, certain it was finally time to show what he was truly capable of. With his hand hovering over the staff, he said he was going to silence everyone who had ever looked down on him. Then a scream cut through the darkness behind him. He turned and saw me and Morris sprinting toward him at full speed. I shouted that if he touched the weapon, his arm would be destroyed on the spot. He turned back to the staff and threatened to grab it if we took another step forward. I stopped. Morris was visibly terrified. Nartz was convinced this was nothing more than a pressure tactic designed to break him. I asked him what he was talking about and told him to come down. He introduced himself as the heir to the Beckenberg family and accused me of being afraid. That pushed me over the edge. I told him directly that he had the lowest scores of any recruit in the group, that his strength and magic were on the level of a tree goblin, and that not even a transcendent could pull a Deca weapon without the proper ritual. He looked at me and asked whether I was judging him like some ordinary person. He believed that truly exceptional people were always rejected first, and that his destiny was to lead those who lacked the wisdom to see it. With that, he reached for the staff. I screamed at him to stop. It was already too late. The weapon responded with an intense burst of violet energy that struck him head-on with tremendous force. He was thrown backward, with no chance to brace himself. I ran over, cursing him the entire way. He was on the ground, crying, and barely coherent, completely overwhelmed by what the weapon had done to him. Morris looked down at him and quietly wondered what he was looking at. I told Morris there was no time left and to get down the mountain immediately. Elsewhere, black magic was being described as one of the most dangerous curses in existence. Uldring announced that the day's training would focus on resistance to something called the Devouring Mist. Swan noted to herself that the ability had its uses, but that it also affected allies, which was the entire reason resistance training existed. Uldring summoned a large sphere of black magic to begin. The recruits entered the mist one by one, each wearing a protective cloth over their faces. Swan reflected that the only real scenario requiring this kind of resistance was one dark elf attacking another. Then Uldring ordered everyone inside to remove their protective coverings immediately. Swan grabbed hers tightly, furious, unable to believe what she had just been told to do. Swan complained that the training was barbaric, nothing more than forced adaptation through suffering. Without the protective coverings, the recruits began to choke and grow sick inside the mist. Uldring moved through them, grabbing one struggling recruit firmly as the young man cried out from the magic tearing through him. As if that were not enough, Uldring then ordered everyone to sing a military song in the middle of it all. Swan stayed on her feet through all of it. She was in pain, tears running down her face, but she did not go down. She thought to herself that Uldring was a uniquely cruel individual. He had mentioned that a transcendent would become his assistant, yet the way he treated people told a different story entirely. She asked herself whether she could tolerate being around someone like him on a permanent basis. The rewards, however, were substantial. She decided she would endure it. The system had its flaws, but reaching transcendent status would free her from dealing with veterans who made her life difficult. She held on until Uldring finally called the end of the session, and the relief she felt was immediate. Outside, everyone rested for 5 minutes before the next stage of the day. Swan sat with her thoughts. She was an orphan with a straightforward goal: save enough money and get out of the army. She wanted nothing complicated. She simply did not want to die, and she wanted to live for at least 500 years. Then Uldring looked up and noticed 2 figures approaching in the distance. Swan followed his gaze and saw me and Morris coming in. I had Nartz on my back. Swan immediately thought he had been caught trying something foolish. Uldring walked over and asked me what had happened and whether the boy was dying. Scully arrived shortly after in a panic, saying there were no healers anywhere nearby. I asked Morris if he could do anything. He told me that buffs and healing were entirely different things. Uldring added that his magic only caused damage, leaving him equally useless in this situation. I sent Scully off to check whether the holy water fountain was accessible, and she ran to look. Then recruit number 7 raised her hand. Swan said, with full confidence, that she could handle it. Uldring and I both turned to her. Swan examined Nartz and identified what was wrong. There was a cursed creature attached to him, a magical parasite known as a dentacula, feeding on his life force. She explained that she could weaken it using a black magic spell. Uldring told her to stop talking nonsense and wait for the healers to arrive. I overruled him. It was an emergency, and it was worth attempting. If it failed, we would wait for help. I told her to try. Swan then turned to Uldring and asked to borrow his staff. The dark elf stared at her, visibly taken aback. Swan took her position beside Nartz, staff in hand, and began. A violet aura surrounded her, as words none of us recognized came from her mouth. A massive magic circle formed on the ground, drawn into existence by the force of the incantation. The spell struck Nartz directly, and his body seized with the impact. The dark creature attached to him began to break apart piece by piece. Swan held the incantation until the very end, and then the parasite came apart completely, its final fragments dissolving into the air. without a trace. Silence fell over all of us. Aldring studied her with a serious expression and admitted that her ability was genuinely useful. I felt the same. Night settled over the camp. The sky burned red. Somewhere among the sleeping recruits, a demon watched with a hungry and terrifying gaze, its attention settling on Swan as she slept peacefully in her bed. The following morning, a carriage arrived at the camp carrying new orders. Scully and I watched it pull in and noticed the military police among those who had come. Scully asked what would happen to Nartz. I told her. She was stunned that he had been so ignorant as to believe he was a chosen transcendent. Then Morris came running, calling my name. He told us that the two of us had been summoned to the officer's room immediately. I could not understand why we had both been called in together. We made our way to the officer's tent with no idea what was waiting inside. The atmosphere inside was heavy. Several officers were gathered around a table. Yaga opened the proceedings by stating that the two transcendents were unstable, having been chosen prematurely, and that Nartz had been thrown into confusion by sudden orders that triggered a sense of crisis in him. He continued, claiming that the two of us had ignored proper procedure out of fear of losing our positions. I could barely contain my anger listening to it. Then Jaga shifted his tone and said that our immaturity was ultimately the fault of our seniors, and that he would take full responsibility and personally discipline us himself. I stared at him and said nothing fit to repeat aloud. Morris moved to defend himself and was immediately cut off by a shout from Moa, a giant sergeant from the 3rd Company, who told him to close his mouth. Then the room shifted. An imposing woman stepped forward and drew every eye in the tent. It was Rebecca, captain of the 3rd Company. She said she was disappointed in us. She told us directly that we needed to acknowledge our mistakes and apologize. I began to do exactly that, and she cut me off before I could finish. I steadied myself and admitted that I had given the order, that I had been careless, and that I had not considered the consequences of what I set in motion. Rebecca told him she was not angry about the mistake itself, but about the failure to own up to it. The military police stepped forward and said they could not let the matter go unaddressed. Jaga tried to intervene, asking for a moment to handle things with his own men. Rebecca ignored him entirely and instructed the military police to have the two of us run in full gear. Then she turned to Jaga and asked him plainly what he intended to do if a transcendent got hurt under his watch. She reminded him that his commander had been at the sauna the day before, letting the implication sit. She then took her leave, demanding a full written report on the incident. As the military police escorted Jaga out, Moa remarked that everything had been resolved cleanly. Rebecca looked at him with open contempt. Unimpressed, she called him aside for a private conversation. The giant sergeant went noticeably rigid. Outside, Jaga found me and said we had gotten lucky this time. The punishment was announced shortly after. 7 days of running in full gear. Morris was shaken by it. I told him he would adjust. Meanwhile, Swan and the other recruits pushed through training in the rain. They crawled through mud, under barbed wire, carried wooden staffs, and marched without stopping, despite the exhaustion and the downpour. They drilled their spells, sending bursts of violet energy toward distant targets until the movements became automatic. 5 weeks later, Swan sat polishing her boots, the routine long since settled into her body. A fellow recruit leaned over, complimented the shine, and asked for help with their own pair. She refused without looking up. Nearby, others were talking about the interview for the top evaluation. Swan smiled quietly to herself, thinking there was still one thing she had never managed to get used to. That thing was Nartz, currently lying in a nearby bed, coughing and looking thoroughly sorry for himself. She thought about how her decision to help him had turned into an ongoing problem for her, and concluded she should have let him suffer the consequences on his own. Jaga then announced he was posting the midterm evaluation results. Swan went to look and stopped cold. Nartz was in 3rd place, sitting just below her and Gia. She stared at the paper. Then she looked over and noticed Jaga speaking to Nartz with a warmth that had no business being on his face. Nartz was complimenting his armor. Jaga deflected with false modesty. Swan understood immediately. Jaga was working the recruit, building favor in case Nartz turned out to be a transcendent. The thought of Nartz reaching that position because of Jaga's interference turned her stomach. Back at the soldiers' barracks, Morris and I were going over the scores. I told him what had happened, that Jaga had manipulated the grades to push Nartz up the rankings. Grades carried real weight for anyone trying to hold a position in the Central Corps, which made the interference worse. Aldring appeared without warning and added that the senior officers would never allow something like this to go unaddressed. Morris asked me why I was not angry about it. I told him it did not matter. He was struck by how unbothered I seemed, but admitted the whole situation unsettled him. Back in the barracks, Nartz was asking Jaga for holy water with the ease of someone accustomed to being served. Jaga, without a moment's hesitation, ordered Swan and Gia to go and fetch it. The two of them hauled a heavy jug between them, grumbling about the errand the entire way. Gia suggested they switch sides to balance the weight. Swan said she would rather set it down and rest before going any further. As they paused, they noticed a row of portraits on the wall. Gia explained they were war heroes. Swan looked at one of the generals and remarked that he was easily the least attractive of the group. Gia went quiet and visibly uncomfortable, searching for something to say, and then told Swan with a stunned expression that the man in the portrait was her father. Swan immediately reversed course, scrambling to find something complimentary to say about his appearance with a strained smile. Gia said simply that, as a soldier's daughter, serving the country felt natural to her. Swan listened and felt a familiar irritation rise in her chest, thinking about how unfair the world was and how many people in it were born into comfort without earning it. She wondered whether Gia was quietly looking down on her for having nothing. Gia, for her part, was thinking about which side of the jug was safer to drink from. The jug filled with water and broke the silence between them. Gia asked Swan what she had put down for the preferential assignment consultation. Swan said that if she did not get what she wanted, she would go to her father's unit. Gia then told her that Nartz had been called in first. Swan felt the injustice of it land hard. In the officer's room, Nartz stood before several high-ranking soldiers. Scully read from a document confirming that he had the right to choose his assignment. Morris grew visibly irritated, muttering that the recruit always chose first without thinking. Nartz said he had made his decision after careful consideration. Jaga stood to the side with a quiet smile, already certain that whichever way it went, Nartz would end up under Uldring's command. Nartz announced that he would be staying at the Central Federation Academy. Then he applied for a position as a knight. The room went still. Every officer present looked at him as though they had misheard. Jaga, the senior knight, stood with his mouth open, unable to form a response. Moa was the first to recover, and he called the decision excellent and courageous, adding that a person's race did not always reflect their true aptitude. Morris turned to me with complete bewilderment on his face. I smiled. I had expected something like this. That night, Morris asked me what it meant for Recruit 13 to be assigned to the 3rd Barracks. I told Morris to watch and he would understand. I explained that Jaga had likely paid off Nartz's parents under the table, and then boasted to the officers that the recruit was a prodigy, leaving himself no room to walk it back. Nartz, desperate for attention from anyone willing to give it, would naturally gravitate toward the one person who had shown him any. All it needed was a small push, and the plan would hold itself together. Morris thought back to what he had heard while carrying equipment that he was dealing with Jaga, a third-rate operator at best. The plan was so convoluted and contradictory that it folded back on itself. That was exactly the point. I called it Jaga's paradox, and it was entirely my design. A few minutes earlier in the officer's tent, Uldring had been going through Nartz's reports, struggling to accept that the boy was an honor student. Jaga stood beside him, wearing a smile that made Uldring's suspicion sharpen. Then the pieces came together in his mind. He saw it clearly, Jaga positioning himself to benefit, while Nartz bore the weight of it all. Uldring realized with quiet fury that he had been cornered. Jaga leaned over and asked whether he had ever heard of simply accepting results. The taunt landed exactly as intended. Back in the present, Nartz slammed his hand on the table and confirmed his decision. His application for a knight position was submitted on the spot, and the shock in the room was immediate. Jaga stood speechless, his expression stripped of everything. Uldring, on the other hand, could not hide his satisfaction. The application was approved without delay, which only deepened the strangeness of the moment. Uldring turned to Jaga and commended him for treating the recruit without prejudice, suggesting that perhaps the higher-ups had recognized his sincerity after all. Moa added that sincerity always prevailed in the end. Uldring then asked Jaga, with a smile that said everything, why the sudden change of heart, and told him to accept the result and follow the order. Jaga burned with anger, but could not say a word in front of the assembled officers. None of them knew that everything had been set in motion by me from the beginning. I gave Jaga a quiet warning that the game was not over. Morris looked at me and arrived at a conclusion of his own, that the real demon in the room was me. Elsewhere, a strange animal moved through the forest, nose lifted, sensing something in the air. A troop of soldiers marched through the trees in formation. Then Gia spotted something on the ground, a rock with an unusual shape. She picked it up and slipped it into her pocket as a keepsake, not knowing what it was. The troop moved on, passing a carriage marked with a red cross flag. I called out for everyone to push through and not give up. Swan was running on empty, but forced herself to keep moving, telling herself the training was nearly finished. I started a marching song to carry the troop through the final stretch. They made it home. 6 weeks of basic training came to a close, and the Deca weapon extraction ceremony began with all the recruits assembled. Morris asked whether the count would start over. I told him it would not, and that if the prophecy held, everything would be settled by the 10th round. Captain Rebecca stepped forward and opened with a brief address, thanking the recruits for their endurance, then announced that the final extraction ceremony for the Dark Mages would now begin. I called out that the class had produced 2 candidates and told them to step forward. Gia and Swan presented themselves and began to prepare. Both of them released a surge of violet energy as they readied themselves for the attempt. Rebecca announced that Gia, second in the class, would go first. Gia stepped up to the weapon with a look of complete certainty and declared that she would become a transcendent. She studied the legendary weapon embedded in the earth and seemed entirely unbothered by the fact that it could not be moved by ordinary means. Scully watched her warm up and remarked that she had the physical strength of an ogre. Swan thought to herself that it came from her bloodline. With everything she had, Gia planted her feet and attempted to wrench the weapon free, using sheer force, crying out her father's name as she released every last bit of her strength. The weapon did not move. She straightened up, caught her breath, and asked if anyone had a pickaxe or a shovel. With Gia's attempt finished, Swan stepped forward. The other recruits watched her in silence, the top of the class, waiting to see what she would do. Captain Rebecca recited the prophecy that the worthy one shall wield the weapon. Swan approached the staff, wrapped her hands around it, and felt the magical energy move through her palms. Morris swallowed hard. Swan drew a slow breath, steadied herself, and pulled with everything she had in one sharp, committed motion. The staff did not move. The recruits fell into confused silence. Swan stood there, unable to process it, certain her calculations had been correct. A memory surfaced the night at the bar, the 2 men she had turned away without a second thought. Something in that memory settled her. She let go of the staff and accepted that it was over. Then she realized her hand would not release the staff. Before she could make sense of it, a powerful red energy exploded around her and swallowed her completely. She had no idea what was happening to her body. The recruits stepped back, frightened by what they were witnessing. I understood in that moment that she had come face to face with the Lord of Jukan Mountain. A dark and terrifying presence materialized before her. It looked at her and said she was weak and without ambition, nothing like the previous owner. It told her she wasted her power reading romance novels, and that on weekends she lost herself in parties and hangovers, living without purpose. Swan screamed at it to stop dragging up her past. Then it paused and told her it would give her the jet black dew. Swan did not understand. The entity explained that she was far preferable to the stinking pig and the eagle eye. The Deca weapon carried a corrupting nature by design, but because she was uncomplicated, she could be trusted with it. The jet black dew was hers. Swan stood there in silence for a moment, then muttered that the reborn empress was not just any romance novel. Then, with a furious shout, she ripped the staff clean from the ground and declared it literature. The silence that followed was absolute. Swan came back to herself, looked at the weapon in her hand, and could not remember exactly how it had gotten there. The recruits rushed forward to congratulate her. The irony was not lost on me. Her complete lack of pretension had given her exactly what she wanted. Swan had become a transcendent dark mage, wielder of the jet black dew. Not everyone received the news warmly. A group of women watched her from a distance with open envy, already calculating. But Gia stepped forward and applauded, saying that if it was Swan, she would allow it. As the moment settled, the silhouette of the mountain range emerged against the darkening horizon. Gia went still. Her expression changed entirely. Her eagle eye had caught something, a deeply sinister aura radiating from the direction of the peaks, concentrated at the very summit. The dark energy sat there like a held breath. And in the shadows of the mountain, several demonic creatures waited in silence, ready to move. The completion ceremony took place that night beneath a heavy and overcast sky. Swan reflected that finishing the training felt satisfying, but there was an emptiness to it as well. Then Xenia appeared directly behind her and called her name, nearly stopping her heart. Swan spun around. Xenia explained that she had not wanted to announce herself and ruin the atmosphere. She then told Swan that she had spotted demons gathering on one of the mountain peaks. She pressed a strange object into Swan's hands and asked her to deliver it to me. It was a spiky, unusual-looking thing. Xenia warned her it was a bad omen. Swan turned it over, wondering if it was some kind of rubber ball, but agreed to bring it. Then Xenia opened her arms wide. Swan had no idea what was happening. Xenia pulled her into a firm hug and thanked her for the 6 weeks they had shared. Swan returned it somewhat stiffly, as Xenia stepped back, waved from a distance, and said her goodbyes. Behind them, 2 recruits who had nearly come to blows at the start were now holding each other and crying. The carts began to move. Swan lost her patience and told everyone around her to keep it down. Standing near me and Morris, she thought quietly that none of them would ever see each other again anyway. I complained that the new soldiers were already daydreaming about vacation. Scully agreed. Morris mentioned that he had joined late enough to spend a few days eating civilian food first. I turned on him and told him he had no sense whatsoever. Elsewhere, Swan was putting on her official uniform and fitting a new armband into place. The outfit was stiff and pulled uncomfortably across the chest. She picked up her staff and told herself that she and the weapon would remain together until the very end. She stepped out of the tent and found Morris waiting outside. He handed her an old book covered in strange runes and explained that it contained the veterans order, the cleaning rotation, and the correct format for reports. He added that the passwords changed every day and warned her that a veteran named Jara had no tolerance for mistakes. He told her to memorize everything and never, under any circumstances, let go of the Deca weapon. Then he left her to it. Swan sat with the book, unbothered. Memorization was something she had always been good at. While she studied, she heard a sound nearby and looked up. It was coming from me. I was training with my sword, working through repetitions. Then I performed a technique that split the rock in front of me clean through. Swan watched from the tent and wondered quietly whether that kind of raw force actually held up in real combat. Then, Swan remembered the strange object Xenia had asked her to deliver. Elsewhere, Uldring was in his tent reading, letting out a satisfied laugh to himself. He set off down the path in good spirits, already thinking about what he would teach his new assistant first. She was sharp, which made the prospect considerably more appealing. He walked the long way around deliberately, just in time to catch Jaga shouting at the black elf for keeping dirty clothes stuffed inside the locker, then continued on his way, humming to himself. His mood shifted the moment he spotted two figures ahead. Two veterans, both on the verge of being promoted to officer rank. The first was Jera, a high-level elven healer known as the Serpent Eyes of the West. The second was Azan, a high-level giant tank the soldiers called the Muscle Brain of the South. The man who had terrorized the new recruits now carried himself like a junior soldier in their presence. Jera looked at him and asked why he was smiling. She pressed him on it, complaining that a rookie had secured an assistant before either of them had. With a thin smile, she told him to bring the new assistant to the recreation room. Uldring muttered that the new transcendent was still in her protection period. Jera's expression hardened immediately. Before he could say anything further, Azan hit him hard and asked whether he was challenging her. Uldring dropped and agreed to bring the girl at once. He walked away, feeling thoroughly miserable. Inside the tent, Swan was seated on her bed, waiting for her next orders. Uldring entered, called her outside, and complimented her posture. Outside, he lit something and asked whether she used a particular herb. She said no. He told her with complete seriousness never to start. She looked at him steadily and said she would not. She asked whether he was not also a veteran, and he explained that the hierarchy ran in strict layers. He told her plainly that he could shield her from many things, but not from the veterans above him. His advice was to stay quiet, draw no attention, and adjust to the situation as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, I was going through a set of documents when I came across the report on the strange object Swan had received from Xenia. The paper identified it as an unusual demon eye recovered from the 9th region. I recalled Swan mentioning that Xenia had found it, and the information put me on edge immediately. Before the demon eye had turned fully purple, an attack team had already moved into enemy territory. The purple coloring meant the demon had completed its scouting phase and was ready to invade. I stared at the report and understood exactly what it meant. The situation had become critical. Morris noticed my expression and waited. I told him to prepare for combat immediately. Morris told me the officer on duty had disappeared and was most likely asleep somewhere in the barracks. I was already moving before he finished the sentence, muttering about the officer as Morris called after me asking where I was going. Without an officer on duty, and with the veterans on leave, the chain of command had collapsed to almost nothing. Then it came to me. The next in line were the two veterans I had just been thinking about. In the recreation room, Jera was already looking at Swan with a smile that had nothing warm in it. Swan stood in front of the two of them, visibly unsettled, with no clear sense of how to handle the situation. She recalled a note she had read that described the two of them as always appearing together and being extremely dangerous. Jera asked how a soldier who had just been transferred already knew so much. Swan froze, searching for an answer that would get her out of the moment. She snapped to attention and gave a formal introduction. Jera asked for the password of the day. Swan answered everything correctly, improvising through the final part. Beside them, Azan watched the entire exchange in complete silence. Then, without any warning, Azan brought her metal gauntlet down on Swan's head. She told her that rookies did not wear short skirts. Jera watched with a smile. Then Jera followed it with a kick of her own, asking whether she needed to make it any clearer. Swan stood with her head lowered as Jera questioned how she had made it into the army at all, continuing to tear apart everything from her conduct to her clothing. Then I came through the door. I held up the demon eye and tried to make them understand the urgency. Jera barely glanced at it and said it would turn purple and that would be the end of it. Before I could respond, Azan's fist connected and sent me across the room. Jera told her colleague to hold off, acknowledging that the situation appeared serious. I picked myself up, demon eye in hand, the color nearly fully purple now. The two veterans looked at each other with matching smiles, entirely unbothered. They played at confusion, mocking my concern back and forth between them. I told them directly that their attitude made no sense given what was in front of them. Jera responded by suggesting I was only making a scene to impress the rookie. Then Azan's kick found me, and I went through the door and out of the building entirely. Azan called down from above, telling me to go clean up the garbage like the recruit I apparently was. I knelt on the ground and thought about every superior I had encountered in that place. Every last one of them had lost their minds. The warning could not have been clearer, and they simply sat there unbothered. I looked at the demon eye again. The purple was almost complete. Time was nearly gone. That same dawn, up in a watchtower, a soldier was complaining about having 40 minutes left before the shift change. Another soldier wandered over to a dwarf on guard duty and asked him to tell a story. A moment later, the soldier lurched backward in terror, pointing at something horrifying directly behind the dwarf. The dwarf burst out laughing and told him the acting was terrible. A giant demon rose up behind them and the soldier's panic became entirely real. The world had been living under an unstable ceasefire following a century of war against the demon race. Slowly, the evidence of that war had begun to disappear. The stains left on battlefields faded with time. The swords that had once decided the fate of kingdoms went quiet and were swallowed by overgrowth. The Federation forgot the oath it had made, and the soldiers who remained thought only about resting in the barracks. Desertions mounted, officers abandoned their posts, soldiers walked away from their duties without consequence. No one noticed how far things had deteriorated until the last line of defense was broken through by a creature known as a Wurgle. A soldier sounded the warning horn immediately, and its call tore through the fort. A desperate shout followed, announcing that a demon had breached the perimeter. The soldiers on the wall stood in disbelief, unable to understand how the creature had gotten past the barrier. Then, it appeared at the top of the wall, looking down at them. It was a low-class demon. The pressure it radiated hit them before it even moved. Soldiers who had never faced a demon before felt their bodies react before their minds could catch up. Then its aura sharpened and its hunger for battle took over. It moved. One soldier tried to raise a defense. The demon's blow swept it aside and connected squarely, sending him down hard. The creature tore through the wall, knocking soldiers off their feet one after another. Another soldier found himself face to face with it on the ground, completely seized by fear, begging it not to come any closer. The demon paid no attention. It moved toward the young man crumpled on the ground, who could do nothing but groan. Then I landed between them. My eyes burned with a sharp yellow intensity. I looked at the demon with nothing but fury and locked in to attack. The strike landed clean. The demon cried out and staggered, its face torn open by the cut. I dropped into a combat stance as it struggled to find its footing. My breathing was rough. This was not a drill or an illusion. The wound on the creature's face and the weight of what stood before me made that undeniable. The elf guy was in shock, unable to fully process what he was seeing. On the wooden tower, Scully and her squad moved into position, arrows ready, preparing to provide cover. The soldiers in the courtyard formed ranks around the creature, setting up for a coordinated assault. Morris was shaking too hard to move. The rookie was not much better. She was sweating, asking herself what that thing actually was. Then something moved through her body that she could not explain. Uldring appeared beside her and asked why she was shaking. Morris scanned the courtyard and noticed immediately that, aside from Uldring, there were no veterans or officers anywhere. Uldring looked around and cursed under his breath, wondering where every last one of them had gone the moment the horn sounded. He then turned to a nearby soldier and told him to stop coughing and put on his protective scarf. The demon pulled itself back to its feet. Then something began dripping from its tail, spreading across the ground in a slow, dark pool. I recognized it immediately. Demon swamp. The real danger of a Wurgle was never just its aggression. The true threat was the mucus its body produced, a substance that spread rapidly across any surface and solidified, corrupting the ground it touched and converting it into demonic territory. Uldring turned to Swan and told her to snap out of it and start using her magic. Then someone said it was his turn to step up. The fat guy arrived on a horse that looked one step away from death. Scully called out to him immediately, telling him to get out of her line of sight. The creature answered by striking him before he could do anything, sending both him and the horse flying without resistance. Swan watched him land. Even that man had stepped forward. She was still standing in place, trembling, contributing nothing. She asked herself what kind of transcendent she was supposed to be. I explained in my mind that if the creature's body went down before the mucus hardened, the swamp would disappear with it. The Wurgle had already been analyzed and there was a strategy in place. It had not fully developed yet, which meant its skin was still soft in places. I moved forward and aimed specifically for the membrane around its joints, focusing on the neck, the creature's vital point. I committed to the strike, intending to cut through the weak spot in a single motion. The attack connected, but the creature was still standing. I could not understand it. The demon had raised its arm and taken the blow, and the force of the deflection threw me off balance. I hit the ground, genuinely confused. Then it came to me. This was not a calculated defense. Protecting the neck was primitive instinct, not thought. I remembered a deserter who had mentioned something similar. I pushed myself up and raised my sword again. Then dark tentacles shot out from behind and wrapped around the creature, locking its limbs in place. Uldring taunted it from a distance, calling it nothing but size and wasted space. The soldiers around the courtyard saw the opening and began shouting for tactical orders. Scully's voice cut through the noise, urging a command. It was only at that moment that Uldring seemed to register that he was the highest-ranking person present, and that the command fell to him. He panicked. He shouted for Morris to cast buffs and for everyone to unleash everything they had. Morris obeyed without hesitation, spreading a field of protective light magic across the soldiers to reinforce them. Scully and her squad loosed a full volley the moment the order landed. The arrows struck the creature squarely while it was still held in place by the dark magic. Uldring pressed the advantage and channeled a considerably more powerful spell. The magic of eternal sleep drove shadowy chains into the demon, binding it where it stood. The creature fought against the chains immediately, straining with everything it had. Uldring was already losing his composure, watching the spell fracture faster than he had expected. He screamed at me to do something. I gripped my sword and waited. He told me to attack before it broke free. The chains were already splintering. The demon was seconds from getting loose. He kept shouting. I blocked it out entirely and held my focus on the target. The chains was about to shatter as it roared that shook the courtyard. I realized that then was the moment. I charged forward with everything I had left, sword raised, swearing to myself that this ended now. Two soldiers watching from behind went rigid at the sight. The blade carved a path of destruction across the courtyard, and in a single, precise motion, the demon's head left its body, rising into the air beneath the light of the full moon. Scully and her squad stood frozen, mouths open. Uldring, Swan, and the young soldier beside them were equally motionless. I stood in the courtyard, breathing hard. Central Federation mid-rank swordsman, Transcendent Gate. Unit infiltrating demon entity Wurgle successfully eliminated. On a distant mountain, something stirred. A dark, sinister energy began to gather, and a massive eye opened in the shadows. It was the presence of something far worse than what we had just faced. Below it, a horde of smaller demons emerged, waiting for orders. It was a Groton, a higher-level, white-bodied demon. A small animal made its way to the Federation's command and control headquarters. Inside, a winged woman sat at her desk when it caught her attention. She reached for a message that had arrived the day before and studied it, unsure of what she was looking at. It was the letter I had sent, warning about the invasion and the absence of the officers. She turned the demon eye over in her hands, the evidence I had included, and shock settled across her face. The scene shifted to the Federation headquarters conference room. The winged woman burst through the door, desperate to deliver the warning, then stopped. The old officer council was already gathered around a crystal orb. One of them remarked that she had arrived at a good time. She steadied herself and realized an irregular signal was coming from the scrying orb. There hadn't been a single afterimage recorded during the ceasefire period, suggesting the crystal tower was no longer functioning. One of the old men examined the letter and immediately recognized that I had predicted the demonic infiltration a full day in advance. He questioned whether the demon's presence had any real basis. The image in the orb answered that for him. The transcendents have proven their value, one of them said. Another senior officer cut in sharply. If the border has been destroyed and the swamp has already spread to the walls, then we don't have time to delay. We should advance our forces immediately. A third interrupted, his tone colder. It is still the ceasefire period. Moving now would only escalate something that might have ended quietly. The younger officer lost his patience and shouted that demons were not people but vermin that needed to be wiped out entirely. He pressed further, demanding to know how anyone could speak of restraint with the defense lines already broken. A third officer stepped toward the map and directed attention to the Groton's Bloodlands, explaining that this was the region furthest from the demon's main territory in the area. Rather than committing the full army, he proposed sending only the 3 Transcendents on a targeted infiltration mission. He then turned and asked for Captain Rebecca's opinion. Back to the wall. Morris had asked me whether he would face punishment for breaking the chain of command. I told him it was an emergency and that I no longer trusted the established system to handle it. Then I watched the swamp begin to vanish. I understood what it meant. A Wurgle with that kind of free movement range was never acting alone. Once the swamp dissolved, it was only a matter of time before regular demons followed the same path in. The Bloodlands needed to be invaded, and the white-bodied host needed to be brought down. The bestiary had laid it all out. I had not read it carefully enough until now. Morris looked at me and asked what would happen next. I told him we were going to march. He stared at me in complete shock. I faced the sunrise and accepted what I already knew. The ceasefire was finished. The time to fight had come. History had never offered any other option. You took down the threat, or the threat took you down. Up on the wall, Jaga appeared looking deeply irritated, demanding to know what had happened through the night. He could not understand why the creature had been quiet and then attacked at full force without warning. He looked at a fallen soldier and told him contemptuously to die quietly, then immediately ordered someone to carry him away. Nearby, the veteran stood smoking, making jokes at the expense of the soldiers who had actually fought the demon. Uldring watched from a distance and found the entire scene deeply disheartening. Then the head officer arrived, already shouting, furious that the reporting system had collapsed into disorder. He cursed at everyone present and ordered those responsible for the mess to clean up every stain and remnant left behind. Rain began to fall. A strange tension moved through the air, and I felt it settle over me, an unease I could not immediately explain. Somewhere inside the fort, a false report was being written crediting the victory entirely to Sergeant Moa, with 0 casualties recorded. The head officer leaned back in his chair afterward, relieved that Rebecca was nowhere near the building. Meanwhile, I stood and asked myself whether any of what had just happened was real. The elven healer watched the group from a distance with a hard and silent expression. All of us stood there wondering if the situation was real. The elven healer wrinkled her nose at the smell in the air and complained that the dirty laundry should have been collected before the rain came. She drove her foot into Morris's head and demanded an explanation. He apologized desperately. She then turned to Swan and questioned why hot water had not been prepared for their baths. I stepped in and tried to explain to Jara that the previous night had been an emergency. The giant cut me off immediately, accusing me of getting arrogant over taking down a single demon. She told me plainly that washing laundry and fetching hot water took priority over everything else as far as she was concerned. Beside her, Jara smiled and remarked that they clearly needed to teach us the basics all over again. That was when I understood the source of my discomfort. The absence of casualties had made everyone treat the night as though it had never really been serious. I thought bitterly that perhaps a loss would have been the only thing to make any of them grasp what had actually happened. The giant noticed that I had stopped hiding my anger. She fixed me with a look that made the temperature drop. Then a soldier shouted that the officer wanted everyone assembled on the parade ground immediately. The giant complained about the rain still coming down, then told us to return to her after roll call. Morris and Swan got to their feet and we moved out. On the parade ground, Sergeant Moa announced he would skip the report and move directly to the decision. Only Transcendents could enter the Bloodlands where the host resided. Regular soldiers could not breathe in demon territory, but the Deca weapons carried a function that allowed Transcendents to manage in swamp zones. Moa shouted that the 3 of us would go in first as the advance team. Once the host was eliminated, we were to signal for the main forces to follow. I said out loud that with the number of demons standing between us and the host, the order amounted to a suicide mission. Moa turned on me immediately, furious, demanding to know who I thought I was, challenging a superior's order in front of everyone. Uldring watched me from the side and seemed to register that I was pushing past the pressure and pointing directly at the problem. I told Moa there was no time and that an immediate advance order was needed. He ignored it entirely, spoke about soldierly spirit, and said he believed in the 3 of us. He ordered everyone to use the rain to clean the grounds and stand by, then announced that the attack would begin at dawn the following day. He dismissed everyone and walked away. I stood there furious. Fully evolved Wurgles would cross the border before the day was out. Every second of delay made the situation worse. The order made no sense, and Moa had no idea what was already in motion. Then a feather drifted down and landed directly in front of me. I stared at it, completely thrown by the sight of it. I looked up and saw a figure cutting through the rainy sky at tremendous speed. Captain Rebecca came down in the middle of the courtyard, and the impact of her landing pulled every eye toward her. She walked straight to me and placed a hand on my shoulder with an expression I recognized immediately. Behind her, her elite squad dropped into the courtyard one by one, ready and composed. Sergeant Moa stared at her in disbelief and asked how she had managed to return so quickly. Rebecca held up the false report and asked him plainly whether he had written it. He scrambled to explain himself. She had no interest in hearing it. She grabbed him by the mouth with her clawed hand and drove a kick into his leg. He groaned from the impact. She crumpled the report in her fist and told him he had written a novel instead of a document, then asked whether he had assumed the transmission tower existed purely for decoration. She continued, saying she did not even need reports to understand what had taken place. One look at the people standing in that courtyard told her everything who had put in the effort and who had spent the night doing nothing. Rebecca straightened, spread her wings, and raised her voice so that every person present could hear her clearly. She told them that starting from that moment, everything was going to change. She announced that she had received an emergency order from headquarters and that this was not a drill. Every person in the unit was to prepare immediately with full combat gear. The captain declared that they were finally going to march to war. The weight of it moved through my body and through the other transcendents standing beside me. A short while earlier, someone had explained that demons were naturally connected through a shared consciousness. Lower-class entities could never move independently without orders from the main host. History and records confirmed this without exception. The Federation leader noted that the ceasefire had only ever been temporary, and that if this moment was allowed to pass, Rebecca had followed by saying the opportunity would never come again. Now in the present, Captain Rebecca led her troops into the demon lands. One of her scouts informed her that he had requested support, but that it would not be arriving due to internal conflict. At the back of the formation, Aldring thought quietly about how the officers currently on leave were getting away clean. It would take too long for orders to reach them. The soldiers around him were openly voicing their fear, and then one of them noticed the smell. They had reached the swamp. The shock of seeing it spread into their territory silenced everyone for a moment. Moa quickly told them to pull their scarves up as they moved through it. Some found it unbearable. Then a soldier stepped directly onto the swamp, and a demon creature surged out of it immediately, launching itself straight for his head. The formation broke into panic. Captain Rebecca ordered the infantry to form up without a breath of hesitation. Tanks to the front, mages behind to provide support. She stepped onto one of the shields, used it to launch herself upward, and brought her blade across the creature's nose on the way down. She landed and told everyone immediately that the nose was their weak point. The soldiers responded at once. Once the nose was damaged, the creatures lost their coordination entirely. Then more demons began rising from the swamp. The soldiers froze at the sight of two of them emerging together. Rebecca called out that they had less time than anticipated and ordered the archers to attack. The arrows flew immediately. The demons deflected them, while the smaller creatures continued pushing forward. The second wave came with full force and moved directly toward the dark mage. Then something crossed the field at a speed that left no time to track it. I put myself between the demon and the others and blocked the blow. I told the group to take the Wurgle's pump, drive the devouring fog into the opening, and eliminate the host. Aldring recovered from the surprise and said that had been the plan all along, then immediately began casting into the swamp, privately thinking that Moa had genuinely intended to send 3 young soldiers in here alone. The moment he finished, a massive shockwave tore through the swamp. I had come to understand their pattern. They responded to ranged attacks by defending against them, which meant closing the distance and finishing it with a single strike was the only approach that worked. I moved in, and with one motion of my blade, I took the demon's head. At the other end of the field, Rebecca and her partner moved at speed, cutting through another demon together. Her partner called out to the others that both Wurgles had been eliminated and that they would be crossing the black bar. The entire formation began moving across the border. Swan's mind was completely blank. She still had not done anything. Rebecca announced that beyond the black was officially demon territory and ordered everyone to move quickly toward the Bloodlands and stay sharp. The elven healer grimaced at a minor scratch on her arm and moved to treat it herself. Rebecca told her immediately to heal the fighters first. At the front, the giant was already in a fury, crushing a nearby creature with a single blow, then grabbing a soldier by the head and reminding him through her teeth that she had told him to shield her from the monsters. From above, Rebecca assessed the squad composition and found it acceptable, then looked closer. The swamp's effects were working against everyone: debuffs, mana drain, and more. Even this far from the main host, the mana pressure was considerable. She concluded that the key to pushing through lay with the transcendence. Her partner called out that the bloodlands were visible ahead. At the rear, demons were approaching in large numbers. Rebecca ordered all light mages to cast World Tree Expand immediately. The mages joined their staves together and raised the sanctuary of the World Tree, an area defense barrier that used the trees along the formation line to block the demon advance. As the monsters pushed against it, Rebecca came to me and said she knew the sanctuary would not hold for long. I agreed. She gave her final orders without hesitation: pour all remaining mana into healing and buffing the transcendence to their maximum, and hold the line with everything left. Then she turned and asked if the three of us were ready. We moved in. One of us immediately complained about the darkness and the inability to see. The Deca weapons activated their breathing function, and I told the others that the defensive function had engaged as well. The weapons were now functioning as torches. I told them to stay close. Both of them agreed, though the fear in their voices was plain. Looking at them, I understood that when it came down to it, this battle would have to be finished with my own strength. Pulling two juniors who had never faced anything like this into the host chamber was a wretched position to be in. I forced the fear down. Morris noted how quiet it was and wondered aloud whether there were no demons in the Bloodlands at all. I knew what the Bloodlands were. This was the host chamber, a space so sensitive that nothing entered without permission. I stepped forward. Something opened its eyes. The host sat alone on a pile of remains, composed and still. The three of us stopped. Morris registered that it was only slightly larger than a Wurgle and seemed to steady himself slightly. Then the creature's body began to change. Every part of it expanded outward, growing until the three of us looked like insects standing before it. Morris came apart. His body shook without him being able to stop it. The host reached down and closed its hand around a boulder. All three of us panicked. It threw the rock directly at us. I moved into a defensive stance and took the full impact, grinding my teeth against the force and the pain, staring up at what stood before us. Swan felt the pressure before she could name it. Morris was beside himself with fear. I tried to hold myself together and stay focused. I could not afford to waver. If my concentration slipped, everyone in that chamber would die. The creature made its power known without moving, and the pressure in the space thickened. Then it charged directly at me. The aura it released on approach hit all three of us like a physical force, nausea rising immediately. Swan dropped to the ground, already regretting the day she had become a transcendent. What we were feeling was not ordinary fear. It was something older, an instinctive surrender written into living things long before any of us had been born. I shouted at them to break out of it. The monster did not wait. It swung with full force. The impact cratered the stone floor and threw a wall of dust across the chamber. I moved at the last possible moment and pulled both of them clear. Standing there, I tried to think through how I was supposed to fight something like this with two rookies at my side. Then Moa's order came back to me. I thought about the people who had sent three of us in here and felt nothing but contempt for every one of them. I pushed it aside. Thinking about it was a waste of time I did not have. The only thing that mattered was bringing the creature down. I told myself the attack patterns were not so different from anything else. I steadied myself, committed to closing the distance, and moved toward its vital points. The monster's speed surprised me. I went to defend and felt immediately that the contact had done nothing. Before I could adjust, the counter struck me with full force, and I was airborne. I hit the ground hard and lay there, taking stock of the damage. The attack had been clean. The execution had been right. The skin had not given way at all. I stared upward, trying to think through what came next. Then my eyes caught something on the creature, a sword design I recognized. The memory arrived before I could stop it. A dark-skinned elf, holding a weapon with an unusual pattern carved into the blade, smiling with complete confidence. He was telling someone that a friend named Leo had drawn it for him. I understood it all at once. That soldier had not deserted. Everyone at the fort had believed it, and every one of them had been wrong. He had come here. He had faced this creature and been defeated, and the demon had taken his strength into itself. And then the full weight of the situation became clear. For a demon that had lived through battles and absorbed the strength of those it had broken, the three of us transcendents with no real combat experience were nothing. We were not a threat. We were something to kill out of boredom. The creature formed a boulder in its hand and hurled it at us. Swan and Morris took the impact directly and were thrown hard across the chamber. They hit the ground and could not get up. The monster turned its attention to me, watching as I struggled to rise. It did not hesitate. It drove its foot down onto me and kept its charge going, pressing forward with the clear intention of finishing me. Swan and Morris watched from the ground in despair. Then Swan made her decision. She began casting. The Throne of Eternal Sleep launched shadow chains at the creature and caught it. But a spell cast through fear cannot hold what it needs to hold. Magic demands concentration the way archery and swordsmanship do, and hers had been cast while her body was still paralyzed. The demon broke the chains without effort and turned toward her immediately, closing the distance at full speed. Morris and Swan looked at each other and arrived at the same conclusion. This was an opponent they could not defeat. The creature bore down on them. I cut at it again and felt the blade skate off the skin. All I could do was defend. It gave no ground and no pause, swinging from above with everything behind it. The impact sent me back across the floor again. I lay there and thought through what had to happen. The neck. The weakest point on its body had to meet the strongest point of the blade at the exact right moment. Anything short of perfect alignment would not be enough. The strategy had to be exact. But we were cornered. Our options had nearly run out. I pushed myself up and asked them whether they wanted to be finished here. I told them that if they did not help me now, we would all go down without having truly fought, and every soldier waiting outside the Bloodlands would follow us. I told them to clear their minds of everything else and put all of it toward bringing this creature down. Swan and Morris looked at the creature with something steadier in their eyes. I told them plainly that the worst outcome was that we all fell in battle together. Swan heard the calm in my voice and felt something in her own chest settle. She turned the problem over in her mind. To restrain something at that level, the only viable option was the Karastra spell. The binding force weakened the further it was cast from the ground, which meant the positioning had to be exact. The only window was when the creature's head came close to the ground. Swan would need to pour every last drop of mana into the spell at that exact moment. The problem was that hitting a stationary target was already difficult. Hitting one moving at that speed was something else entirely. I voiced the same concern out loud without realizing Swan had already been thinking it. She went quiet for a moment. Then she had it. She understood that if inertia increased, the momentum that needed to be controlled would increase with it. She called out to Morris and told him to cast a buff on one of the creature's legs only. She told him they had no other option and to move quickly. The creature was already charging again. Morris chose to trust her and committed every last bit of his remaining energy into a physical strength enhancement targeted at the single leg. The magic connected, and the leg lit up with a blue aura. Swan steadied herself and waited. The creature attempted to leap. The imbalance hit it immediately. One leg, carrying far more force than the other, sent it spinning in midair, completely unable to correct itself. The demon came down headfirst into the ground with tremendous force. Swan cast without hesitation. The Jewer Pastissimo Necomary Dark Magic drove claws of dark energy into the creature and locked it in place. I could not believe the plan had actually worked. Swan called out to me, her voice strained, the spell already pulling everything she had left out of her. In that moment, she remembered the night she had watched me training alone. The basic combat stance, the sword raised, the stone-cleaving slash she had once wondered about. Whether that technique had any real use in actual combat, she shouted stance 1. I understood immediately. I raised my sword and moved into the first form, every muscle behind it. Morris spent what remained of his mana on one final enhancement buff and directed all of it to me. I told them both that I was taking back what I had said about them being useless rookies. Then I brought the blade down. The stone-cleaving slash connected with the demon's neck as it lay against the ground. The head came away clean. Swan and Morris stood completely still, mouths open, unable to process what had just happened. I stood there breathing hard, staring at what was in front of me. Then my eyes caught something inside the creature. I moved closer and recognized it immediately. I brought the blade up again and cut the body open. There inside was a grown lip, a special organ found only in high-class, white-bodied hosts. Every transcendent present felt the energy radiating from it. Swan could only watch as I consumed it. The wavelength of the rib was such that whoever matched it would confuse its smell for taste, triggering something deep and involuntary. As I stood there, I felt something moving through me that had nothing to do with digestion. This was a union of power with the rib itself. I began testing what had changed. Swan and Morris watched in disbelief. The highly active proteins that had been absorbed pushed the consumer directly to the absolute limit their body could sustain without breaking apart. My combat power had tripled in a matter of seconds. None of this was in the demon bestiary. The only way to know it was to have entered the Bloodlands yourself. I turned to face them and told them they had both felt the wave of shared consciousness. I warned them that the battles ahead would grow considerably more brutal, but that the reward would be determined by contribution. Information about those rewards would be shared within the squad. That was our rule for surviving as Transcendents. Swan and Morris agreed without hesitation. Swan looked at me afterward, and thought quietly that the way I saw things did not seem entirely human. I already understood that what lay ahead was not limited to combat. War was never won with swords and spears alone. The dirtiest part of it was the political maneuvering carried out by those who never set foot on a battlefield. I had already seen the cowardice of my superiors clearly enough. They had taken what was not theirs. And the names of those who had actually fought and bled would be quietly removed from any record that mattered. At that same moment, something touched Moa. He understood too late. He was going to die where he stood. A memory came to him before the end, an elven friend who had refused to drink with him out of commitment to his daughter, and the man's elven wife arriving to scold him and warn him away from Moa's company. The old man had carried a life full of regret and pain. Then, as he surrendered entirely to what was coming, the creature vanished. Not just from him. Every demon in the area disappeared at once. The dark elf and the soldiers present looked around in complete shock. Captain Rebecca shouted for the barrier to come down. The swamp was fading as well. The white cloud trees still standing confirmed what she suspected. No demons remained in the vicinity. The archer exhaled and pulled in a breath of clean air for the first time in what felt like hours. Then figures emerged from the deep darkness. Everyone turned to look. It was me, carrying the host's severed head, with Swan and Morris at my side. Rebecca had been prepared for total annihilation. Those who had lived through the opening ambush of a world raid understood exactly what had just been prevented. What had been achieved here was the result of the transcendence. We had earned it.
Rebecca looked at us with a smile spreading across her face. She understood. The entire army erupted in celebration over what the small group had achieved. The elven girl ran toward me with open arms, and I stepped aside before she could reach me. A dark-skinned elf nearby scoffed and called us brats. Rebecca appeared and scolded him for talking with his mouth full while on duty. The healer told me I was making too much of the whole thing. The giant added that if she had been able to enter the Bloodlands, she would have destroyed everything in there without difficulty. I looked at them both and said nothing. They had never faced a white-bodied host, and they never would. One glance at them confirmed they had not participated in this battle. The true danger of what demons were capable of had not yet touched them personally. That gap in understanding between those who had faced it and those who had not was enormous. Among the Federation troops, attitudes toward the situation were worlds apart. Most of them still had no real grasp of how close things had come to being completely over. Time passed, and Moa ordered the soldiers to begin repairing the walls and establishing camps. A memorial recorded 11 wounded and 4 fallen in the last engagement against the monsters. Scully readied herself and accepted that casualties were now unavoidable. She loosed an arrow and took down a purple energy creature on the battlefield, then called out that the defenses needed to go up quickly because the demons had returned to the wall. Morris told her from above that taking the Bloodlands had not been the end of it and that they would need to grow accustomed to pushing forward. Meanwhile, Moa called out to the giant, and she told him she had not finished her current work. Materials needed to be moved to reinforce the positions. She asked whether the younger soldiers could handle it, but Moa told her that when I was involved, the work moved considerably faster. I asked him whether he wanted me to carry the bricks to the perimeter. He said yes, then went quiet. He and the giant both stared as I lifted the load without any visible strain. Moa asked if it was not heavy. I told him it was manageable. The giant looked at the stone, and Moa told her to try lifting it herself. She did not. The irritation on her face said everything. This was what it actually meant to be a transcendent. My attention moved to the ruins surrounding us. Before the reversal, this entire continent had belonged to the Federation. I stood with that thought for a moment. Then someone called out for attention. An inspector named Norman arrived and announced that he carried a message from headquarters. Moa asked what he wanted. Every eye shifted to the inspector. He revealed that the next enlistment badge for the Federation enlistment unit had been completed and that the Deca weapon revelation was finished. Moa was caught off guard by the news and said it had come considerably faster than usual. The soldiers around him brightened at the thought of reinforcements arriving on the battlefield. I watched the reaction carefully and wondered quietly who the next person would be. Moa told the messenger to deliver the full report. The messenger announced that according to the revelation at the Jukin Mountain Pass, the next Deca weapon to be claimed was the gauntlet. He then confirmed that it had been assigned. Moa declared that this was excellent news for the unit. The giant burst out laughing. Her direct subordinate was finally on the way. She clenched her fist and said that whoever the rookie was, they could consider themselves finished before they even arrived. The look in her eyes had nothing reasonable left in it. She finished her own thought by saying she would personally show the new recruit what a real nightmare looked like.
The day of enlistment finally came, and I raised my voice to full volume, ordering the new recruits into line and demanding their attention. Among them, one stood out immediately. Goliath, a specialist in close combat, and beside her, Titan, the so-called Iron Hero, holder of 5 continental strength records. I knew better than most that battlefield glory rarely matched real war, and standing there barking commands at rookies, I couldn't help but wonder why someone like me, a transcendent, had been pulled back to camp at such a crucial moment. Not long before, my old squad had been uneasy about my leaving, worried about holding the front line without me. It was Moai, our one-eyed commander, who'd assigned me as temporary instructor for the giant recruits, insisting that duty at headquarters would be far easier on me than combat ever was. I went along with it, well aware the old man was really just covering himself in case something went wrong out there. With no better option, I said my goodbyes to Morris and to the dark elf who'd fought beside us. I told Morris to forget everything I'd taught him, and he answered with a sharp salute. Even now, I still hope the two of them are doing fine. Then I was pushed aside, and the giant instructor took over, snapping orders at recruits who already looked exhausted. She announced that their first day of rest had been scrapped, and physical evaluations would begin immediately. Whoever passed would earn the right to lift the legendary weapon buried in the Crimson Cloud Mountains and be named a Transcendent. The news sent a wave of excitement through the recruits, while everyone else would simply be shipped off to nearby units to uphold the giant's reputation. Watching from the back, I noticed she was holding up better than I expected. My attention shifted to Senior Drini, who looked utterly worn down. She'd been pulled from field duty to handle cooking for the main camp, and she wasn't shy about complaining that feeding giants meant 22 hours of labor and barely 2 hours of sleep. She joked it would be easier to just fight demons instead. Before she could say more, the rations officer hauled her away, and the giants fell into formation to begin their fitness trials. A crowd gathered soon after to check the posted result. It turned out the competition for the Transcendent slot had narrowed down to just 2 names, Titan and Goliath, both with measurements far beyond the clan's average. Their grip strength alone was destructive, and they shattered every record in the stone-carrying trial. Titan already held a continental title in a major athletic event, while Goliath was known as the reigning heavyweight champion of a military tournament. The whole unit buzzed with anticipation over the coming clash between the two. Titan spotted her across the field and locked eyes with a hard, threatening stare. Goliath caught wind of the rumors surrounding him but brushed them off, keeping her focus locked on her own goals. Titan, though, couldn't hide his irritation at being measured against someone he saw as beneath him. Unable to let it go, he strode over, held out his hand, and asked if she was Goliath. She shook it, and he flashed a mocking grin, calling it a real pleasure, right before crushing her hand with brutal force. Goliath felt the strain shoot through her bones as Titan taunted her, asking if she was faking pain just to get attention. She snapped back with an insult through gritted teeth, and he only smirked wider, surprised she could take the pressure without flinching. Before things escalated, another recruit, Baba, stepped in to pull them apart. Titan threw out a threat before walking off, and Goliath muttered that she wished they'd settled it in a ring instead. Titan just laughed her off and left with his followers trailing behind him. Baba wasted no time griping about Titan's attitude, calling him nothing but a flashy show-off. Then he admitted he was actually a huge fan of Goliath, going so far as to ask for an autograph on his underwear, which she flatly turned down. He joked that with a little more mascara, Titan's eyelids could pass for pastry, and urged her to wipe the floor with him during trench training. As they walked off together, Baba rambled on and on about sweets, and Goliath quietly decided the guy talked way too much. Back in the supply room, the instructor asked one last time if anyone needed a different uniform size, but nobody spoke up. Officer Bronson mentioned to me that the army had shipped in extra-large uniforms for the giants under direct orders from above. She recalled that Moai himself came from the giant clan, which explained the unusually generous preparations for these rookies. I reminded her that humans and dwarves were treated as lower priority, so our sizes were always in short supply, a point the old man and I had butted heads over before. Night settled over the camp, and the guards called for lights out. The recruits grumbled about the cramped, uncomfortable quarters. Baba tried an old trick his mother used to help him fall asleep, but it only gave someone nearby a headache, and Goliath and the other giants listened in, silently judging him as a bit of a mama's boy. Then the curtain to the barracks was thrown open, and an officer called for trainee number 1, Titan. He jolted awake and answered at once, while Goliath immediately clocked that he was getting special treatment. Titan strutted out with a smug grin plastered on his face. He was led into the meeting cabin, where Moai greeted him cheerfully, even asking for an autograph. Then, just as quickly, the commander reminded him that whatever fame he carried outside these walls meant nothing here, where he was simply a trainee like anyone else. Titan straightened up and declared he'd work hard to prove himself. In truth, Moai had already decided Titan would be his unit's Transcendent. He just needed him to make that clear through his own effort. Moai told him to wait there until the permanent staff arrived, after which he'd be sent back to the barracks. As they stepped out, Moai remarked to the giant instructor that Titan's lack of pretension was what made him likable, and she found herself agreeing, briefly wondering if he might really be the one to carry the clan forward, before quickly taking the thought back. That's when the parent guards showed up, immediately putting the blame on Moai for the delay. They told Titan it was time to head to the barracks, but he simply took a slow sip of water, acting as if he hadn't heard a word. Irritated by the stalling, the guards told him to move it, and something in Titan snapped. He couldn't understand why nobody around him seemed to grasp who they were dealing with. The comments set the guards off, and they demanded to know what he just said. Without so much as a change in his expression, he told them he'd said nothing at all. One guard stepped closer, daring him to repeat it, and Titan rose to his feet, shouting again that he hadn't said a thing. The soldiers clapped their hands over their ears as their bodies shook, asking if he'd lost his mind. He kept his stare fixed on them, calling them weak, worthless, empty of any real value. Then he branded the guards nothing more than filthy beggars who didn't know their place and dared them to do something about it. The guard tried to reclaim some authority, roaring that this kind of attitude was outright insubordination. But before he could finish, Titan lunged forward, seized both guards by the face, and hoisted them clean off the ground, daring them to come at him with their weapons if they dared. He admitted almost mockingly that he despised military life and would rather be thrown into solitary confinement. Then he hurled both men into the barracks wall. My guy just stood over them, and moments later, someone outside shouted, drawn by the commotion. The next morning, the two guards reported everything to Moai, but the old man brushed it off as nonsense, demanding to know why humans were always so consumed by jealousy and resentment. He accused them of nursing an inferiority complex toward the giants and told them to drop the matter entirely. Despite their small numbers, he reminded everyone, the giants carried enormous military value thanks to their natural traits, which made them a priority for deployment across other units. Titan just smirked, watching Moai tear into the soldiers. Baba wandered over afterward, asking what exactly he was up to. Titan just laughed, saying things were about to get interesting. Meanwhile, back at the front, Morris told the dark elf that once he mastered the wide area breath spell for the swamp terrain, he wouldn't need his scarf anymore. Still, he couldn't help wondering why they'd been ordered to practice whistling of all things, and whether I was holding up all right back at the main camp. Back at base, I warned the recruits to mind their heads as they filed in for meals. Baba asked the server for seconds, only to be told to get lost. Then the giant instructor snatched the ladle from her and dumped in nearly every ingredient without restraint. Walking past, I asked the recruits what was tangled in their hair. Spider webs, they told me, a side effect of being tall enough to catch them constantly. It reminded me that size wasn't always an advantage. As I moved on, one recruit mentioned he'd heard I was the transcendent instructor who'd taken down both Wargle and Grothin, and he seemed genuinely stunned by it. They muttered among themselves about how I was still ranked intermediate. One rookie reasoned that promotion standards were probably strict given the rigid class hierarchy, meaning the title of Transcendent didn't come with much real benefit. Another argued that triple salary and a pension after service were plenty of incentive. The first shot back that he doubted the pension would ever materialize, since most Transcendents didn't live long enough to collect it. Still, the other insisted the triple pay alone made it worthwhile. Their conversation was cut short when another recruit dropped his tray in front of them, Titan, who casually told them to clean it up, further irritating the pair. From behind, Goliath spotted him and muttered that he was a real punk. Baba, though, just grabbed the tray himself, saying he'd be cleaning up anyway, so why not start now? Goliath asked if he was really that much of a pushover, but he just smiled in response. She found herself wondering, almost idly, where his accent came from. Later, training moved to pillar throwing, where recruits had to launch a heavy wooden pillar at a marked target. Using Titan's form as the example, the instructor had the recruits attempt the same throw. The first one up couldn't even get the pillar close to the target, prompting the instructor to wonder aloud if anyone could manage it. Then came recruit number 8, Goliath. She threw with everything she had, and the pillar struck the mark dead center, stunning the others into disbelief. Titan just crossed his arms and smirked. Baba gave her a thumbs up, complimenting the shot. She thanked him and asked again about his accent. He said he was from Songdongrad in the north, jokingly asking if that made him sound a little exotic. She cut him off, recalling that the north was where the demon plague had first broken out. Baba tried another flat joke in response. Another rookie chimed in that only lesser humans succumbed to the plague anyway, then asked if giants even lived in that region. Baba paused before answering that it was manageable enough. Just then his name was called, and he stepped up, hefted the boulder, and hurled it with full force, only for it to sail clean over the target. Bronson approached, asking if he was doing this on purpose, and whether he even planned to try. The recruits murmured among themselves. By the end, only Goliath and Titan had actually hit the mark, and Titan didn't hesitate to call the rest idiots. Moai then decided that before continuing, given Baba's gloomy face, he ought to sing a song. Baba immediately stepped up and began singing, which annoyed everyone within earshot, earning him more mockery as a mama's boy. Even Titan found it dull enough to just walk off. Elsewhere, The two soldiers from earlier were hiding out, dodging their shift and grumbling insults about Titan, complaining they'd had enough of the giant's arrogance and reminding themselves they only had to endure 6 more weeks before assignments were finalized. Titan showed up right then, greeting them mockingly as big brothers and asking what they were doing there, recalling that they'd threatened to throw him in the brig, wondering why they hadn't followed through. The comment cut deep and one of them spat back, calling him a bastard. Around that time, I was hauling a demon trap for a training demonstration when something caught my eye. It was Titan and the two soldiers, stripped down and already badly beaten, standing in silence. Titan noticed me first, remembering what the other recruits had said about my reputation as a transcendent instructor, and decided to test his luck. I set down the trap and asked what exactly was going on and why they were half naked. The two soldiers panicked, scrambling to explain, but Titan stayed composed, stepping forward to say he'd heard plenty about me. He extended his hand, introducing himself as a future transcendent and asking me to look out for him. I took the handshake, and he tried the same crushing trick he'd used before. I didn't move an inch. He seemed confused by my lack of reaction, and I felt a faint itch of irritation, wondering what he thought he was doing. Then it clicked, and I asked if this was the same stunt he pulled earlier, squeezing back hard enough to nearly snap his arm. His expression twisted instantly as he screamed, suddenly desperate to know who I really was. He dropped to his knees, unable to process what was happening. I asked coldly what the problem was, telling him to keep going with whatever he'd started. His body shook uncontrollably, words failing him. I pressed further, pointing out that he'd been so eager to flaunt his strength earlier. He looked up, stammering, begging me to let go. When I finally released him, he collapsed to the ground. I told him flatly not to let all the praise go to his head, that he wasn't anything special. I'd seen plenty of men like him before, cowards who only looked for cheap shots when they thought no one was watching. Now look at him, falling apart the moment he felt real strength. Pathetic. I warned him that if he wanted to get along with me, he'd better drop the act and play innocent from now on, because if I ever caught that look in his eyes again, it would be the last thing he did. The two soldiers stood frozen, shaken by the way I spoke, while Titan clutched his aching hand. Back at Growth and Outpost, the elf asked Morris what he was doing, and he explained he was practicing hitting 120 decibels as instructed. The dark mage told her to stop chatting and get back to work, while the commander could sense tension building. At the training grounds inside the trench fighting arena, the giant recruits gathered to watch the next match. One of them asked Titan if something was bothering him, but he brushed it off, telling them to get lost. Baba asked Goliath if she knew what was eating him, but she guessed he was just anxious about the possibility of losing. Instructor Boris then called Group B forward for combat. Baba, standing at over 3 meters and known affectionately as the Mama's Boy, was matched against David, the smallest among the giants. David decided his only shot was strategy, drawing inspiration from the red-tempered hamster that took down prey far bigger than itself. Convinced that battle was all about momentum, he let out a sudden scream, and Baba, comically, slipped straight off the field. David was almost surprised his trick had actually worked. The other recruits jeered at Baba's clumsy exit, but he brushed off the embarrassment easily. David, meanwhile, was already convinced his technique was flawless. Baba just grabbed his clothes, saying he couldn't afford to miss watching the next big match live. Next up was Goliath against Titan. He told her he wasn't in a good mood, so he'd be going all out. She just wondered what nonsense he was on about now. Recalling my earlier warning, Titan told her he wanted to see if she could still talk after he broke a few of her bones. She just smirked and waved the threat aside. The match began, and the two collided with enough force to send shockwaves through the ground. Titan smirked, convinced raw strength would decide everything, but she slipped free of his grip and shoved him down. The other recruits watched in disbelief, wondering if they were witnessing two seasoned fighters clash, and whether she already had the upper hand. One cautioned it was too early to call, since combat wasn't just about throwing someone to the ground. Titan, visibly furious that she had real skill, lifted her onto his shoulder, stunning the crowd that he could hoist another giant so easily, proof of his sheer physical dominance. But Goliath wasn't finished. She locked her legs around his head, twisted into a cobra-style hold, and pinned his neck. Titan reacted by slamming her down hard, and in that instant of pain, he broke free, mounted her, and prepared to strike. His punch landed, but somehow it failed to connect properly. Goliath managed to block it, then drove her foot into his stomach, knocking him back before regaining her footing and striking again with full force. The recruits were stunned, the two never letting up for even a moment's rest, and the crowd began cheering as the battle raged on. Brute strength against technical skill. Hours passed, and Goliath told him he was about to pass out and should just give up, but Titan refused. She warned she could keep going all night. Watching the clock run down, Instructor Boris called the match, declaring it a draw. But the moment Goliath let her guard down, Titan struck, grabbing her by the throat and trying to choke the life out of her. The recruits panicked, shouting, and even Boros looked shaken. He wouldn't let go, no matter how much Goliath insisted insisted the match was over. His anger hadn't cooled at all. Then he heard my voice, cold and firm, ordering him to stop. He froze for a moment before releasing her. Silence fell over the recruits. Even Boris looked stunned. The same man who ignored everyone else instantly obeyed me. It only fueled Titan's fury further, and he swore that once he claimed a Dika weapon, he'd turn my life upside down. The rivalry between the two remained far from settled. Soon, the morning of the blade ceremony arrived. Guards called the recruits forward to collect their final weekly tags, and everyone marveled at how quickly 6 weeks had passed. What once felt endless now seemed to have flown by, now that they'd grown used to camp life. Goliath felt as if it were only yesterday she'd first arrived. Baba mentioned he'd roughly tallied the scores and believed she'd taken first place, though she remained doubtful with Titan still in the running. Back at the temporary barracks, we reviewed the recruits' individual scores, only to find that Goliath and Titan were tied exactly. I told Moai that even after a second check, both sat at 973 points out of 1,000, a result unheard of in the history of the blade ceremony. Privately, I thought a score was just a number. In the end, the weapon made its own choice. We brought the recruits to the blade ceremony grounds in the Decafon Highlands, deep within the Crimson Cloud Mountain. Moai announced that due to urgent conditions on the front lines, the ceremony would be shortened, calling trainees 1 and 8 forward. Titan stepped up first, muttering that it probably wouldn't matter anyway. Goliath simply sighed and let him go ahead. As I moved in to inspect him, I told him to prepare himself and draw the weapon. His expression shifted with relief, certain this was finally his moment to claim a Dika weapon and begin real training as a transcendent. But reality hit hard. The weapon wouldn't budge for him. Even Moai looked baffled, and Boris confirmed the weapon simply wasn't rising. Titan's face flushed red with confusion as the other recruits stared in disbelief that he wasn't the chosen one. I told him plainly that he'd failed and needed to step aside. He resisted, but I repeated myself, telling him to leave. He finally stepped back. Baba laughed, remarking that his personality alone disqualified him, and that naturally, Goliath, with her balance of skill, character, and looks, would be the one chosen instead. But to everyone's shock, she failed as well. The recruits could hardly process it. Both Titan and Goliath had failed. Another soldier approached me, pointing out how rare this outcome was, then asked whether recruits still earned bonus points for killing a demon, recalling the moment Baba's stray throw had struck a wild demon lurking near the training field. I checked the results and told Moai that trainee number 15 had earned a bonus, bringing his score to 851. More than enough to qualify for the ceremony. Moai looked intrigued and called for number 15, Baba. He looked utterly horrified as Moai announced it was his turn, silently thinking there was no way someone like him could possibly be a transcendent. The recruits murmured, recalling that the Dika weapon in question was called the Rage Tear Gauntlet, and doubting whether a self-proclaimed mama's boy could ever wield something like that. As Baba approached the weapon, fear washed over him, and his mind drifted back to everything that had led him here. He'd grown up the way his mother described it, found abandoned just outside her hut in the dead of winter. And despite the biting cold, she swore he smelled sweet to her. He remembered being happy even as a small child, eating his fill every single day while she quietly went without, making sure there was always food on the table for him. She was frail, her hands and feet constantly trembling from the cold, yet she'd still hand over her own gloves to keep him warm. He often wondered why he'd turned out this way, absurdly large, unnaturally strong, while she wasted away in front of him, even watching her cough, looking as though death could take her any moment. She never stopped smiling at him. He couldn't understand why she'd taken in someone like him, a giant, someone no one would ever accept as family, and raised him as her own. That confusion sometimes turned to anger, and he'd shouted at her once, telling her she shouldn't pretend to be his mother, unable to grasp why she endured so much suffering for his sake. Then came the day he learned she was sick. She told him the doctor had confirmed it was the plague, and there was no cure. Even from her sickbed, she told him this might be the end, apologizing for not being a better mother to him. But more than anything, she wanted to hear him say it one more time, just like when he was small, wanted him to call her mama. That was the moment it truly hit him that everything was ending. He broke down crying like a child, calling out to her, begging her not to leave. He kept sobbing, pleading with her to stay. In that moment, she seemed to soften into someone young again, cradling him in her hands and telling him that hearing him call her, that had been the greatest gift she could have ever asked for. She said that whenever she smiled at him, it felt as though she had everything in the world, and that even after she was gone, he shouldn't cry or carry anger with him. She wanted him to stay bright, cheerful, talkative, just as he'd always been. Her smiles, she explained, weren't because she was happy, but because his happiness was what made her smile. She asked him to promise in his heart that he understood she loved him. When he buried her, he thanked her for being his mother and swore that from that day on, he would smile every day and carry her memory with him, hoping that in her next life, she would choose to be his mother once more. With that final goodbye, he left her resting place behind. When he arrived at the enlistment camp, he carried her words with him, determined to keep smiling. Certain things would get better. And now, here he was, hoisting a Deca weapon in front of all of us, stunning everyone present. The Rage Tear Gauntlet had been successfully claimed. The mama's boy had officially become a transcendent. Later, I found myself at the stables, releasing a Bloodland horse, curious whether the beast-type mount would suit the boy's training, and wondering if he'd been following the instructions I'd given him. For a transcendent to truly fulfill their role, they needed to push themselves and actively pursue advancement within the system. Baba emerged from his tent shortly after, fully dressed, looking a little out of place. I told him the carriage was full, so he'd need to ride up front instead, and he accepted without complaint. As we rode through the night, the two of us stayed up front together. At one point, I told him he could rest until morning given how serious the situation was, but he insisted on staying awake and asked permission to bring something up. I told him that from now on, he should address me as intermediate. He seemed puzzled, since the recruits were giants, but I stood among the instructors. I asked if he had some objection to how I'd trained him, but he assured me that wasn't the issue at all, so I gave him the real explanation. The front line's advance had only recently begun, and the transition of command wasn't fully settled yet, meaning there was no one else familiar enough with the training procedures to take over. Regardless, now that preparations were complete, our distance from the main base would only keep growing as we pushed forward. Starting with the next intake of recruits, only those matching the required training benchmarks for their position would be sent out from headquarters at all. That applied to him now, just as it applied to me. Until this campaign reached its end, neither of us would be returning to the main camp. I admitted I wasn't sure if what I was telling him was entirely reassuring, but I welcomed him formally into the Transcendent Corps anyway. He smiled and promised to give it his best, which was good enough for me. The deeper we pushed into demon territory, the stronger our enemies would become, and the Transcendent Corps would need to grow stronger right alongside them. I made a quiet vow to hold our ground, certain that whatever we achieved through blood and effort would never be wasted once this war finally ended. The next day, we reached our destination, and Morris shook Baba awake, who jolted upright in surprise. Morris teased him for sleeping while his senior handled pulling the cart. Baba scrambled to his feet, saluting immediately and promising to correct the mistake. Morris told him to grab his bag and follow, and Baba obeyed without hesitation, realizing he'd arrived at the Growth Outpost, where the atmosphere felt noticeably tense. It was an uncomfortable adjustment, but he knew he'd need to settle in fast. And just like that, Baba and I had reached the front line together. After settling in at the temporary Growth Outpost on the front line, Baba couldn't shake his nerves. He turned to Morris and offered to help, but Morris waved him off and kept working. Not long after, he spotted the dark elf, Swan, and asked where she was headed. She explained that Senior Jara had summoned her to the temporary barracks. Morris quickly stopped her, saying he needed to go over something first, and told Baba to wait nearby while he read through a document with her. Swan asked if it was an AR-based spell, wondering if it targeted the respiratory system, and Morris confirmed it, explaining it was a purification spell he designed himself to give soldiers permanent resistance to the swamp's toxic gas. He asked for her opinion, and she noted that since the underlying magic was Java-based, it was tricky work, but with a few adjustments to account for the variables, it could turn out quite effective. Meanwhile, Baba lingered in the hut, still on edge, until someone tapped his shoulder. It was a pig-like soldier, telling him to follow. Outside, the pig mentioned that since Baba was new, he probably didn't recognize him, then asked if he knew anything about Wargle. He claimed to have played a decisive role in the great battle against Wargle at the training base, pointing to a faint scar as proof, though Baba honestly couldn't spot anything there. The pig went on to reveal he was actually a dark elf with a knight-class lineage tracing back to the prestigious Beckenberg family through someone named Marta Winker von Beckenberg, boasting that such distinguished bloodlines rarely crossed paths in ordinary society. By the end of this rambling explanation, Baba hadn't understood a single word of it. That's when both of them sensed something off. Baba could tell the aura radiating nearby was far too strong to belong to any ordinary beast. The pig, despite his earlier bravado, looked visibly frightened, though he tried to play it off as routine. Morris showed up just then, asking what they were doing and telling Baba to come along, informing him he'd been assigned to maintenance duty on the fortress wall. He explained that as members of the Transcendent Corps, they were held to entirely different standards, with plenty of extra scrutiny from others, so Baba needed to adapt quickly and memorize the documents he'd been handed. As they walked, Morris mentioned that regular soldiers near the swamp needed scarves for protection, but Transcendents were naturally resistant. He then pointed toward a stack of blocks being assembled nearby and told Baba to join in. There, a lean soldier and a dark mage were struggling to lift even one block, and they froze in disbelief watching Baba hoist one effortlessly. I directed him to stack it in place and introduced him to the dark mage as the newest recruit. She was startled by his sheer size, taller even than Senior A's, and asked whether what he was carrying felt heavy at all. Just then, Baba spotted his senior and immediately snapped into a salute, boulder still balanced on his shoulder. She was furious, demanding to know why he looked so pleased with himself and whether he thought this was some kind of joke, saluting like that while carrying a load. Then she turned to me, warning that if my new junior thought military life was easy, I'd better set him straight unless I wanted trouble. And I agreed. As we walked off, she muttered to herself that she'd expected either Goliath or Titan to end up here, never someone like this, and found herself wondering, not for the first time, how I, a mere human, could lift that same boulder so effortlessly. A soldier posted in the watchtower called out to me, warning me not to wander too far and to watch my step, since although the monsters couldn't leave the swamp zone, the area still carried real danger. Looking out over the swamp, I explained that this stretch of land belonged entirely to the demon host's territory, and encounters with these creatures weren't uncommon. The primary source of the swamp's toxic emissions came from a beast-type wugu, weaker than the standard variety but still worth caution. Then I noticed Baba hesitating, like he wanted to say something. He pulled out a strange purple orb, calling it fruit, explaining he'd seen them scattered everywhere and, being hungry, wondered if they were edible. I quickly informed him those were actually decayed eyeballs shed by the swamp creatures, and he dropped them instantly, realizing the foul smell he'd been noticing wasn't from the swamp itself, but from the orbs. Up close, though, he realized his sensitivity to smell made the swamp gas far more tolerable than he'd expected, mostly thanks to the Deka weapon's built-in function, the crimson cloud breath, which purified the air surrounding Transcendence. Meanwhile, back at the barracks, Swan stood before a visibly irritated Senior Jera, who seemed displeased with whatever Swan had brought her. Swan privately reflected that an entire hour had passed already, and the whole ordeal felt like it was looping endlessly. It had started when Jara sent her to retrieve a hair tie from the barracks. Unable to find one matching what Jara wanted, Swan had returned with the one she was already wearing, unsure what else was expected of her. Kira flung the rubber band aside in disgust, and Swan's frustration simmered, feeling this woman was determined to ruin her mood entirely. Kira snapped at her, saying she should have died out in the Bloodlands instead of coming back alive, insisting she'd never encountered someone as useless in her entire career. Swan apologized, which only angered Jara further, who threatened to tear her mouth open if she apologized one more time, a threat that left Swan completely cornered. Jara pressed her again, asking if the task had really been that difficult, and when Swan stayed silent, Jara repeated the question. Just as Swan opened her mouth to apologize again, she was struck across the face, silencing her completely, a clear sign of just how deep Jara's resentment ran. Then an announcement rang out from the administration office, calling all Transcendent troops to report to the company command office. Scully, the archer, appeared and asked if Swan had missed the announcement. Jara, clearly irritated at the attention Scully was drawing, snapped at her to take Swan and leave. As they walked off, Scully asked if Swan was holding up okay, and Swan assured her she could manage. Scully admitted she'd gone through similar treatment when she first arrived, but promised it wouldn't last more than 3 months. Swan thanked her for the concern. At the company commander's office, we received a briefing on a beast-type demon known as Haka, a creature with a giant, segmented leg-body structure that commanded 2 growth-in-class jointed subordinates, hunter-type demons that struck viciously and exploited enemy weaknesses, particularly during daylight hours. During what was called the Day of Reversal, this creature had single-handedly wiped out 3 entire divisions with its signature attack, earning its reputation as the demon responsible for the highest casualty count on record. The commander stressed that eliminating the host, Haka, was the top priority, though its 2 subordinates were far from easy targets themselves. He explained that our defenses had held up until now, mainly because beast-type demons instinctively avoided approaching when they detected the scent of their own kind's blood. Now that core personnel had returned, reorganization would proceed under command orders, with the next operation set to begin in 4 days. He noted that typical hosts were fiercely territorial and rarely strayed from their bloodline zone, but this particular beast type, aggressive and unusually active, wouldn't stay put except while sleeping, meaning a full-scale confrontation between us and the demons was highly likely. I remarked that this called for a defensive strategy, and the commander agreed, explaining that was exactly why we had archers capable of both defense and offense, along with harpies suited for hit-and-run tactics. But since the host's 2 subordinates move quickly enough to counter ranged attacks, such lighter forces alone couldn't inflict any meaningful damage. That left the burden squarely on the Transcendent Corps. Even though the battlefield wasn't technically the Bloodlands, the responsibility was falling entirely on us, and he asked if we understood. We all saluted in acknowledgement. For me, The most pressing concern was catching everyone up to speed. Unlike Morris and Swan, Baba was a raw recruit, and the two of them wouldn't be able to compensate for his inexperience alone. The three of them would be tasked with handling the two subordinate demons, while I alone would take responsibility for the three-legged host, Aka, itself. It was mealtime, and Baba was practically glowing with joy over his food. He couldn't remember ever eating anything this good in his entire life, not even the meals he'd had back home as a civilian. Morris asked if it was really that impressive, and Baba insisted it tasted just like his mother's home cooking. I told Morris there was no point even asking. The guy was such a glutton he'd once mistaken a wugu for a berry and tried eating it, which left Morris completely stunned. After that, I ordered them to hurry and finish eating so we could regroup at the entrance to the Growth and Bloodlands. Once everyone had gathered and we'd gone over the necessary preparations, I explained that regular soldiers typically steered clear of this area, but as we advanced, transcendent briefings would now take place right near the Bloodland. I reminded them that during our last engagement, killing the host, Grothan, had caused his subordinates to vanish instantly along with him. This time, though, things would play out differently. Even if we took down the host, only his direct subordinates would disappear. The two smaller demons, Zaga and Raga, wouldn't be affected by the host's death at all. Morris asked if it wouldn't make more sense to eliminate the host first, reasoning that once the lesser subordinates vanished, we could turn our full attention to the remaining two. I told him that was exactly why I'd had him training the way he had. Swan pointed out that if these were linked joint bodies, it meant Zaga and Raga were on the same level as Grothan had been, a host commanding two creatures of that caliber, and she couldn't help wondering if we could actually pull off a victory. She glanced over at Baba, surprised by how calm he seemed, and asked if something was bothering him. In truth, his thoughts were elsewhere entirely. He was reflecting on everything that had been done for him, the food, the clothing, even the tripled salary. Now here she was asking how he felt, and he wondered if he should hide just how genuinely happy he was. So instead, he calmly remarked that the soup tasted a bit bland compared to traditional recipes, which caught her completely off guard. I then instructed the group that since Baba lacked real combat experience, he'd stay behind while the rest of them pushed forward. 3 days would be more than enough time to prepare, and we'd work on coordinating teamwork the following day. As night settled over the training camp inside the headquarters tent, Rebecca sat deep in thought, recalling what I'd told her, that her active support was essential for this operation, and that 4 years earlier, she'd been the deciding factor behind the success of the QR landing mission. I'd asked, humbly, for her help in securing this victory. It was in that moment she realized I clearly wasn't destined to remain just an ordinary soldier. Suddenly, the leader of the Harpoon mobile platoon burst in, calling her name in a panic. She asked what was wrong, and he stammered out that the swamp had breached the walls and entered the outpost. The news hit her hard. Reaching the outer wall, she was stunned to see the swamp had already broken through the fortress defenses, with Giz and Visworkle creatures swarming against the temporary barrier. Her attention then shifted to a nearby hill, where their true target sat motionless, simply watching. He informed her that the temporary wall had reached its breaking point for the day. Rebecca immediately ordered Moai to rouse everyone and get them armed and assembled, silently questioning how this had happened when they were supposed to have 4 full days of safety. The platoon leader explained that the mucus being expelled by the beast's organs was far more abundant than anticipated, and thinner in concentration than typical wugu secretions, which allowed it to spread faster than expected. That meant even within the fortress walls, soldiers wouldn't be able to breathe safely, and there simply weren't enough scarves to go around, with the ones currently in use steadily deteriorating. Scully arrived and saluted, reporting to Rebecca that all Federation troops were armed and in formation. Rebecca studied her for a moment, surprised, and asked if she was truly a transcendent soldier, wondering how she could stand there without a scarf and seem completely fine. Scully confirmed she was unaffected, explaining that Morris had cast a respiratory protection spell on her. Rebecca called for Morris, who stepped forward immediately and explained that after resolving a minor issue with the spell, he'd successfully tested it on regular soldiers, and it was now ready. If she gave the order, he could cast it across the entire battlefield at once. Rebecca asked how long the effect would last, and he explained that when fully cast, it lasted indefinitely. The power source was breath itself, so as long as someone could breathe, the spell simply never ran out. Both Rebecca and the platoon leader were taken aback by this. With her approval, Morris cast the wide area spell across all the assembled troops. As he completed the incantation, a brilliant light burst from his wound and spread across the entire area. The soldiers realized almost immediately that they could breathe freely without their scarves. Rebecca herself was amazed. The sheer relief of having that suffocating restriction lifted was overwhelming. Facing a sudden battle with no time to prepare was daunting, but at least this gave them one genuine advantage, and she resolved to use it to rally the troops' morale. I called out to Morris, who answered with a bright smile, quietly hoping this achievement might earn him a special promotion. Just then, Rebecca rose into the sky, hand resting on her sword, and called out to the soldiers below, declaring at the top of her voice that the swamp gas could no longer hold them back, that they could breathe freely now, and from this moment forward, the fortress gates would open. It was simple, she told them. When the demons surged through the entrance, the troops would form a wing formation, concentrate their attacks, and grind every last one of them into dust. The instant those demons set foot inside, this ground would become their grave, and we would claim this entire territory on the edge of our blades and spears. Glory would belong to us. Her words ignited the soldiers' spirits, and they echoed her declaration back in unison. Then she gave the order for the gates to open. Every soldier stood ready. Slowly, the massive doors began to part. On the other side, the beasts and monsters were already poised to strike. The linked joint bodies, Raga and Zaga, stood alongside their snarling leader as the giant-legged joint body, Haka, let out a thunderous roar, signaling the assault. The lesser beasts surged through the gate first, leaving their boss and his two subordinates waiting just outside. The battle broke out, with both sides starting on equal footing. The demon horde surged forward, their focus locked entirely on the gate. In response, our forces spread into a wing formation, unleashing concentrated firepower. Unlike our previous encounter at Grothin, where we'd been caught marching into an ambush, this time the advantage was clearly ours. Everything up to this point was unfolding exactly as Rebecca had planned. She gave the order for rapid fire, and Scully's unit released volley after volley, picking off the approaching monsters. When one of the lesser Wugu leapt straight at her, she cut it down effortlessly with the blade mounted on her bow, taunting it with a question about how many arrows she'd already loosed in her career. Meanwhile, Rebecca surged forward, cutting through the enemy rank, then glanced back toward the bunkers to confirm they were holding the line against incoming creatures. She noted that more than half the demon force had already broken through into the interior, while the rest struggled to push in from outside. Splitting their numbers like this would inevitably shatter their morale and coordination. This, she realized, was the perfect moment for the Transcendents to move in. She shouted the order for us to advance. The others and I surged forward with everything we had, driving straight into the beasts crowding the entrance. One swing of my blade sent several of them sprawling. Baba matched the pace, smashing through the ranks with his fists. I called out that Baba and I would carve the path forward while the rest stayed close behind us, reminding them that clearing lesser enemies wasn't the priority. Reaching the boss as fast as possible was. They all agreed, and we pressed on, cutting down anything that stood in our way. Our first breakthrough succeeded. Now our sights were set on the boss itself. From the wall, Scully called out once more, wishing us a safe and victorious return. Outside, we kept advancing, eliminating every monster that crossed our path. Swan couldn't hide her surprise. This was technically Baba's first real battle, yet he showed no hesitation whatsoever. A tank, she figured, was still a tank regardless of experience. I pushed forward, mentally tracking the distance between us and Haka. 500 yards, then 300, then just 100. We finally closed in on the creature. It stood there on its four limbs, almost smiling as though it had been expecting us all along. I caught something out of the corner of my eye and dropped low just in time to dodge a vicious strike from its two subordinates, though I didn't escape entirely unharmed. The two minions, one marked by a yellow limb, the other blinded, positioned themselves beside their leader as they closed in. Swan cast one of her spells, summoning dark shadows to seize all three creatures, but they slipped free of her grip with ease. Their speed caught me off guard. Then Baba spotted one closing in and charged at full force, landing a solid hit. Clearly startled by his own success since he'd swung somewhat blindly and still connected. It struck me that his straightforward nature was exactly what fueled his fearlessness, though some might simply call it raw talent. Behind him, Morris recognized that the ideal support combo for a tank started with a defense boost and cast it on Baba immediately, who visibly felt its effect kick in. Watching this, I allowed myself to think we might actually have a chance. Suddenly sensing movement to my left, I surged toward the boss with full force, striking with everything I had, only for it to vanish the instant before impact. In the next breath, I felt its presence directly behind me, already poised to strike. I attacked again, and again, it disappeared. After just 2 exchanges, the truth was clear. Even with my stats strong enough to wield the great sword one-handed, cutting down something this absurdly fast was simply beyond me. The creature was toying with me, circling at blinding speed. Sensing it behind me once more, I struck, but it caught my weapon between its teeth and used the leverage to hurl me into a boulder with tremendous force. As I fell, it seized the opportunity to strike again midair, launching me even further, leaving me completely unable to respond. Morris and Swan both shouted my name, snapping me back to focus. I pushed off and charged the creature again, ordering them not to worry about me, and instead concentrate fully on the enemy in front of them. Swan quickly cast another spell, Throne of Eternal Sleep, summoning chains from the ground, but the creatures dodged them easily. She realized her magic simply couldn't match their speed. As they lunged forward again, Baba stepped in with both fists raised, managing to hold them in place. Swan felt a flicker of dread, recalling something from our training. The Dark Mage had once mentioned a single black magic formula capable of sowing confusion, turning enemies against each other. But right now, Baba was already visibly being overwhelmed. Swan called out to Morris, asking if he trusted her judgment, and he immediately told her to just say what she needed. She asked if he could mute the area or cancel ambient sound entirely, since the confusion spell only worked in silence. He understood instantly and cast another spell, one that spread rapidly across the battlefield. With that, our opening strategy was finally in place. The sensory deprivation field had been activated. Before this battle even began, Morris had warned me that since mana was limited and the human body naturally tended to revert to its original state, any strength-enhancing buff would only last a short while. Metal, on the other hand, held its enhanced structure far more reliably. Given that Morris, Swan, and Baba would be handling the two subordinate demons while I took on the leader myself, he figured a strength buff wouldn't really serve me. I told him we'd go with a blade buff instead. He seemed surprised, asking if that alone would really be sufficient. I assured him it would, explaining calmly that his part in this fight mattered far more. He needed to conserve his mana for whatever emergencies might arise. As long as I had the blade enhancement, I'd manage just fine. So there I stood, facing the monster armed with that enhancement, the blade buff known as Blacksmith's Torch. Back in the present, as Morris unleashed the wide silencing spell, the sensory deprivation field, Baba noticed the entire area had gone eerily quiet. Morris signaled to Swan with his hands, indicating he'd muted every sound except her voice, urging her to stop hesitating and cast the spell already. She snapped into focus, running through the incantation in her mind, forming frost with her breath and shaping her tongue like a serpent's. She called out the spell's name, a curse-type confusion spell known as Wicked Tongue, designed to amplify mutual hostility and turn targets against one another. Instantly, the two demons spun to face each other, consumed by killing intent, tearing into one another. Morris was overjoyed it had worked, thanking Swan profusely. Then, without warning, Baba scooped him up, announcing it was time to move to Phase 2. Looking up, Morris spotted Rebecca soaring overhead, arms outstretched to catch him. Baba launched him upward with full force, and she caught him midair. He was startled, but she remained completely focused, recalling everything I'd briefed her on beforehand. The amplification tower could only be reached by flight, surrounded by turbulence so severe that only someone with prior experience navigating it could pull this off, which meant the task fell to Rebecca alone, given her history successfully leading the NASA amplification turbulence operation. She quickly warned Morris that once they entered the turbulence zone, she wouldn't be able to speak, since sound would become amplified there, and told him to simply follow the plan as arranged. Morris felt his nerves spike, but he steadied himself, remembering our strategy. Due to the demon race's shared consciousness, beast-type demons instinctively growled in response to a whistle signal from a higher authority. By exploiting that reflex, we intended to freeze Haka, despite its overwhelming speed. Earlier, he'd told me he had something planned specifically for my benefit, even pushed to his absolute limit with a cardiopulmonary buff. His whistle could barely generate 1 Pascal of pressure, and by known standards, higher-tier demons typically only responded to 10 pascals or more. But I told him 1 Pascal would be plenty, since the amplification tower would multiply any sound near it tenfold, turning it into a deafening roar. Inside the tower, both Rebecca and Morris covered their ears as they approached. Rebecca set him down and moved to leave, signaling with her eyes that she'd return to retrieve him once he'd sounded the whistle. He understood immediately. He just needed to wait until she cleared the amplification zone. Once she was gone, it was his turn to follow through. Drawing on the cardiopulmonary buff, he inhaled with everything he had and released the signal. As expected, the tower amplified it tenfold, and the sound reached every corner of the battlefield, freezing every monster in place. It wasn't just the creatures near us. Every beast-type demon along the front lines stopped cold and began growling in unison. That was our opening, the chance to strike before they can move again. Seizing the moment, Scully found her mark and struck the exposed creature before her. She wasn't alone. Every soldier on the field moved in, including the pig-like soldier and the spear-wielding knight, both capitalizing on the opening. Even Swan, ever the archer at heart, followed suit, briefly recalling the earlier moment she'd asked Morris what he'd been practicing. Meanwhile, their leader, Haka, let out a furious howl. Watching it all unfold, I knew the plan had worked. Spotting my own opening, I shifted into stance, the Allied Federation's standard sword technique, basic form 2, and launched forward to end this in a single strike. Rock-shattering horizontal cliff aimed straight at the creature's neck. I held on to what I told my teammates earlier, since this wasn't an actual command from a higher authority. The lack of any shared consciousness response would eventually register as meaningless noise, causing them to disregard it entirely. Which meant we had exactly one chance, and this was it. The instant I struck, I froze in place as blood sprayed everywhere. But it wasn't the leader's blood. It belonged to one of his subordinates who had thrown itself in front of the strike meant for Haka. I couldn't understand it at first. Why had it positioned itself there? Had the whistle signal simply failed to reach him? Meanwhile, on Bappa's side of the fight, one of the demons was still fully active, and Swan couldn't figure out why. How had things unraveled like this? The moment Morris had sounded the whistle, both creatures had frozen and begun growling in response. Swan had immediately signaled Bappa to strike, using the reinforcement buff Morris had placed on his arm. He surged forward, aiming to crush the creature's skull with everything he had, only to be blindsided by an attack from the second demon, Zaga. Swan quickly attempted to cast her Shadow Arm spell, but the creature dodged every attempt with ease, breaking away and charging straight toward its leader. That's when she realized the truth. One demon had rushed to protect Haka, while the other had simply snapped out of its trance. She recalled with a sinking feeling that the one who'd charged toward Haka had no ears at all, which explained why neither the confusion spell nor the whistle had worked on it. This was the worst possible outcome. Back in the present, Haka had already broken free of the trance, though it had cost one of his subordinates its life. I understood immediately that our operation had failed, even though we'd managed to take down one demon. The fact that Swan and Baba hadn't regrouped with me yet meant their side of the plan had collapsed too, and Morris still hadn't made it back from the amplification tower. With no other options left, we had to move straight to our final contingency. I charged the creature again, striking with everything I had, but it slipped past effortlessly and appeared behind me. It struck, and though I managed to dodge enough to avoid the worst of it, I still took damage, barely holding my footing as I turned to face it head-on. I could tell it was reacting instantly to my every movement, hunting for any opening that would let it land a killing blow. Pure animal instinct honed for survival in combat. Exactly what I'd feared. Haka could sense on some primal level that I was weaker and infinitely slower than him, so he decided to draw this out and toy with his prey. When he struck again, I managed to block with my great sword, but the sheer force nearly overwhelmed me. He kept attacking, and I wove through the assault as best I could. But before I could clear one strike entirely, another landed, and I barely caught it on my blade, the impact sending me skidding back several meters. His speed operated on an entirely different plane than mine. I could do nothing but stay defensive. No matter how much stronger I became or how sharp my blade grew, I was a tortoise facing down a hyena. All I could manage was barely dodging while holding my ground, and even that wasn't enough, as he kept pressing forward, driving me back further. If this came down to sheer attrition, I knew I stood no real chance of winning. My only hope now rested with my team, and I silently urged them to hurry. Captain Rebecca dropped Morris off before flying away again, and he understood instantly. The amplification tower plan had failed, meaning we were shifting to plan B. Meanwhile, Swan called out to Baba, asking him to hold the beast back just a little longer while she prepared her next move. Before she could act, though, a mana range expansion buff washed over her. Turning, she saw it was Morris, arriving to lend his support. He understood the proper mana distribution was the key to this final maneuver, and he planned to funnel every buff into Baba at the critical moment. Swan shouted back that she understood. She just needed to spread her ink mist all the way to the master gate. But it lay beyond her line of sight, leaving her uncertain how far to extend the range. Casting blindly risked draining her mana completely. Fortunately, Morris had already confirmed the location. The mountain sat just over 4,000 meters out. She locked that distance into memory, planted her staff into the ground, and began reciting the incantation. Dark mist immediately began spreading across the battlefield. She knew casting something on this scale would inevitably affect her allies too, but she also realized, almost with surprise, that the training she'd once dismissed as pointless was finally proving its worth. She'd once wondered what purpose a simple wide-range ink spell could possibly serve, and now she understood exactly how it fit into the plan to bring down an opponent as monstrously strong as this one. At the same time, Baba was sent flying, slamming into a nearby boulder. He hadn't been able to overcome his opponent, leaving only Morris and Swan still standing on that front. The mist continued spreading. I noticed it just in the nick of time. The ink mist had arrived. With Swan and Morris having completed their part, I felt confident our first plan would have worked, but this final gambit left me far less certain. Still, with no other option remaining, I had to commit to it fully. I began swinging my massive blade wildly through the surrounding mist, using its layered darkness to obscure Haka's vision and buy myself room to maneuver, leaving after images trailing in my wake. But against the razor-sharp senses of a beast-type demon, true escape was never really possible. Driven purely by instinct, Haka lunged at me, relying solely on raw animal reflex. Mid-attack, I slipped behind a nearby boulder for cover, and the instant he crossed that line, I poured every ounce of strength I had into one final, decisive strike. Back on Morris's side of the battle, Baba managed to hold the creature in place. Though he could tell this beast possessed insane speed, he could only match it in raw strength, and that alone wasn't enough. Pinned as he was, he couldn't accomplish anything meaningful. The monster let out a piercing screech and swatted him aside with its tail. Swan cried out his name in alarm, but in that critical instant, the creature turned and lunged toward Morris instead, then vanished entirely. Morris couldn't make sense of it. Why had the beast simply passed him by? Then he remembered Swan shouting Baba's name moments earlier, and it dawned on him the creature wasn't tracking by sight at all. He immediately cast the sensory disruption field to block its hearing, and instantly it froze in place. Seeing it stop dead, Swan repositioned herself right away. Morris regrouped with Baba, telling him he was about to apply a strength buff since they needed to reunite with me as quickly as possible. Swan warned him they had to be patient, waiting until the creature was fully restrained before buffing Baba, since they wouldn't get a second chance at this. She turned to Baba and asked how he planned to finish it off, and drawing on every bit of training and combat experience he'd absorbed, he told them plainly he intended to choke it out and wouldn't release his grip until its neck gave way. Swan then instructed Morris to follow the same approach they'd used before, waiting until Baba had it locked down before channeling every ounce of strength buff into him at once, while she'd back him up with her Shadow Arm spell. Baba approached the frozen creature with deliberate calm, his nerves clearly on edge but his composure holding steady, moving slowly toward the unresponsive beast. He circled behind it, ready to seize his grip, then leapt and locked his arms around its neck, but Swan immediately cast her Shadow Arm spell, pinning it firmly in place. Morris followed through with a compressed strength enhancement buff, multiplying Baba's power more than tenfold. Drawing on every bit of that surge, Baba clamped down with everything he had. Both Morris and Swan placed their full hope in him, and with one final push, he wrenched the creature's head clean off. At the same moment, hidden behind my boulder, I recalled the lesson my teacher had once drilled into me. Turn an opponent's own strength and speed against them. I settled into an attack stance. Haka pursued me without a second thought, and by the time it sensed something was wrong, it was already too late to rein in its own momentum. Precision would overpower brute strength, and timing would triumph over speed. Drawing on the Federal Army's standard great sword technique, Basic Form 2, I severed the creature's head with a single stroke, the stone-crushing horizontal slash. Instantly, all the lesser demons around us began dissolving into ash. The surviving soldiers let out a collective breath of relief, and even the elf archer realized we'd secured victory. Meanwhile, Morris's group rushed forward, hoping desperately that I was unharmed, but the moment they arrived, Morris stopped cold. Lying before them was the severed head of Haka and its subordinate. They called out my name, addressing me by rank. I simply stood there in silence, calm, then turned to thank them for their effort. Baba practically buzzed with excitement over having killed a demon, though he also couldn't help thinking I was a little unhinged. He'd always known my training was solid, but he hadn't expected this level of skill. Baba wondered aloud if this was going to be a daily occurrence from now on. Morris, meanwhile, admitted that now that his buffs had worn off, his entire body ached, and he genuinely hoped the next recruit assigned to them would be a healer. Just then, both Swan and Morris noticed something familiar in the creature's remains. The exact same phenomenon we'd witnessed back at Grofon. I moved quickly, slicing with precision. They looked stunned, watching me handle a massive sword with the finesse of a kitchen knife. With a few careful cuts, I extracted Haka's special cuts, meat from the thigh and the neck. I was honestly surprised to find 2 special cuts this time, yet I felt none of the strange hunger I'd experienced before, almost as if I wasn't the one meant to claim it. I turned to the others and asked if anyone else sensed something similar. Baba, despite being the resident glutton, felt nothing at all, but Morris did, and alongside Swan, the 2 of them ate their portions. Once finished, they exhaled deeply, both remarking on how impossibly delicious the meat had been. I realized then that Swan had unlocked a special ability, Fear, capable of freezing an opponent instantly in place, while Morris had gained Afterimage, an ability that boosted his movement speed. I smiled, pleased that both of them had walked away with genuinely useful gifts. Looking out toward the horizon, I mentioned that Haka's bloodlands weren't far from our outpost, and once we finished up here, we'd head back. Deeper within the territory, we came across a horde of treasure. Since these were beast-type demons, none of it had been touched. Everything remained exactly as it had before the war began. I noticed the chests were sealed tight, meaning we'd need to haul them back and find a properly ranked chest specialist to open them. But glancing over, I caught Morris already prying one open with a screwdriver, casually mentioning his father had once worked as a blacksmith. Right then, I decided it would be wise to keep our storage lockers properly secured from now on. It had been a battle that looked utterly unwinnable, Yet through sheer desperation and teamwork, we pulled through. We returned bearing the enemy's severed head and the spoils claimed from the battlefield. My team, the Transcendent Unit, marched back in near total silence, the atmosphere so heavy that no one dared speak. Even Rebecca understood in that moment that she could place her full trust in me. The Transcendent Corps was no longer some distant aspiration. It had become essential to the Federation itself. We were, from that day forward, known as heroes. Back at the construction site of the Haka Outpost fortification, Scully jolted awake, roused by the commotion, as someone informed her she'd been ordered to report back to the induction center, explaining that the newest batch of trainees consisted entirely of archers. The moment she heard this, she shot up immediately. The induction center sat at the main base in the Jokun mountain range, home to the next Deka weapon, Gandiva. Before she departed, Morris asked if she was ready. Privately, he found himself worried the next Transcendent might turn out to be some overly muscular elf, and he admitted, half-jokingly, that he envied her getting an easier assignment back at the induction center under the pretense of training. She shot back that having to mentor someone was hardly a luxury, though she couldn't quite hide how pleased she actually looked. The instant Scully mentioned hot water was ready, Morris vanished on the spot. Wishing her well, his sudden burst of speed catching her completely off guard. Swan walked in shortly after, asking if she was heading out already and whether she needed a carriage arranged. Scully declined, explaining her mount was already waiting. The moment she reached out and touched a nearby tree, a creature dropped down from its branches, startling Swan, who asked if she could get a ride too, only to be told the beast wouldn't tolerate just anyone. Swan wished her a safe journey as Scully rode off with the creature. I arrived not long after and told Swan that the archer's timing was fortunate since the higher-ranked officers would soon be returning. Swan wondered aloud if I thought some of them wouldn't make it back, but I told her it was likely most families would simply be reassigned and that everyone would return safely except, of course, for those who didn't survive. The next day, at the induction center headquarters, our girl had already arrived, having traveled through the entire night, cheerfully joking about finally being away from the front lines. Her family background was unremarkable, neither noble nor especially common, solidly middle class, and being the third daughter, she'd always been handed whatever responsibilities no one else wanted, her grades throughout training having been thoroughly average. The next demon territory targeted for clearing was a slugwatch habitat, and while Transcendents earned promotions for such kills, for an ordinary soldier like her, simply being included in this operation felt like a dream come true. Walking toward the assembly point, she knew without a doubt that she was the center of attention that day. She addressed the newest batch of recruits, introducing herself as their instructor, Scully, senior archer. Upon seeing her, the recruits immediately began murmuring among themselves, puzzled that their instructor wasn't a Transcendent, questioning which noble elf family she must have descended from, since none of them recognized her name. Scully's demeanor shifted instantly, warning them that if anyone uttered another word, she'd show them exactly who she was and where they currently stood, backing the threat with the sheer weight of her veteran experience. For just a moment, the trainees felt as though they were standing before a battalion commander. She informed them that given the current situation, their training schedule would be brutally compressed and she wouldn't be repeating herself. For their first lesson, that need to demonstrate their archery fundamentals, and Scully stepped forward to show them exactly what was expected. First, adopt a compound stance, angling the body sideways to minimize exposure to long-range attacks. Second, use the mid-blue grip as the foundation. Third, when aiming with the Federation bow, use the center notch of the sight, 1 notch for 100 meters, 2 for 200, 3 for 250. Fourth, release the arrow while exhaling slowly, aiming for the gold, the designated target zone. The recruits were stunned watching her hit the mark without even a moment's hesitation, recognizing this as exactly the kind of precision required to remain in the central unit, Transcendent or not. Scully then asked if anyone required a left-handed bow, and hearing no response, called for trainee number 1 to step forward. Regina Durang, pride of the Durang lineage, stepped up, and the other recruits instantly recognized her as the most gifted member of her family, several already privately betting she'd claim the Transcendent slot. As expected, every arrow she loosed struck the target's red line dead on, a flawless performance befitting the Durang prodigy. She casually remarked that it felt almost too easy without her personal bow, prompting her friends to laugh, joking that after a display like that, who could possibly outshine her? As the remaining recruits took their turns, it became clear that aside from Georgina, almost none of them could even land a hit on the target. Then trainee number 12 was called forward, and shockingly, not a single one of her arrows struck anywhere near the mark. Curious murmurs rippled through the group as they recognized her. Robin Belliard, a celebrated figure among elven performers known for touring the continent. She carried herself with striking elegance and beauty, and several elves who'd secretly admired her from afar found themselves blushing at how much lovelier she looked in person. Georgina, though, sneered, mocking her figure and suggesting she must eat far too much. insisting real elves should be lean and nimble. Her friends added that Robin's family were nothing more than singers and musicians who treated bows as instruments rather than weapons, dismissing them as talentless frauds who leaned on gimmicks because they lacked actual combat skill. Georgina declared it was because of people like Robin that other races looked down on serious archers like herself, questioning whether she'd really have to train alongside a mere performer. Just then, another elf stepped forward, telling them that was enough, reminding everyone they were all trainees here with no need to rank one another, and asking pointedly whether Robin had ever actually wronged any of them. This was trainee number 7. Askalheim's, Robin's childhood friend. The others simply laughed her off as Scully called for the next round to prepare firing. Georgina needled her friend, asking sarcastically if she'd rigged her bow properly, claiming she wouldn't land a single shot with that setup. Robin said nothing, simply studying her weapon in silence. Askal, likewise silent, stepped calmly onto the firing line. Scully immediately recognized her as the young head of the Hermes family, longtime rivals to the Durangs alongside Georgina, and a strong contender for the transcended position herself. Curious to see what she could do, Scully watched as Asal called for a 250-meter firing range. The other recruits were startled by the sheer distance, wondering if everyone from the Hermes bloodline stood that tall. She gripped the bowstring firmly, drew back, and released. The arrow struck dead center with a sound like a cannon blast. Even Georgina couldn't process what she just witnessed. A perfect gold. Under Federation scoring standards, a perfect gold meant striking the innermost black target zone precisely, and everyone present struggled to believe she'd hit the exact center. Some assumed it had to be luck, but she fired again, landing a second perfect gold, splitting her first arrow clean down the middle. Disbelief spread through the crowd. Her third shot followed suit. Another perfect gold. Scully stood there, thoroughly impressed, praising it as a true Robin Hood shot, a flawless run of perfect golds from the 6-foot master archer, Askalheim. The rest of the recruits immediately realized how baseless the claim had been that the Hermes family couldn't measure up to the Durangs. Even Georgina looked visibly rattled as Askal walked past her, offering a casual thanks for the arrow. Her teammates muttered in confusion, wondering what on earth was wrong with her, asking if she was okay. Georgina simply told them they'd deal with her properly that night. Just then, someone called out to Askal, and turning around, she found it was Robin praising her shooting. Askal only smiled in response as Robin asked how her mother was doing and whether she should pay a visit sometime soon. Askal mentioned her mother had been talking about Robin quite often, and the two slipped into an unmistakably warm, affectionate exchange, leaving the other recruits puzzled by the obvious closeness between them. Robin, noting a flaw in her earlier shot, adjusted her form by 15 degrees and demonstrated the Fire East style, remarking how impressive it looked. Askal seemed genuinely surprised. Robin then pulled out a small flower bracelet and handed it over as a good luck charm. A few of her admirers stepped forward asking for autographs, which she signed without hesitation. Watching her, Askal realized that despite the years apart, Robin hadn't changed a bit since childhood. Scully called everyone back together, instructing them to set down their bows and announcing that the day's training would end early, giving them free time before dinner. She told them all to sit and rest, news that immediately lifted everyone's spirits. She then called on Robin, asking her to play something to help ease her exhausted comrades, a request Robin happily accepted. She introduced the piece as belonging to the National Fairy of the Earth era, Robin Blade, and readied herself to perform. The recruits looked on in astonishment as she used her bow itself as an instrument, and the moment she began playing, tears started falling freely. The melody was that beautiful. Even Scully felt a wave of calm wash over her as she listened. Back at the Haka outpost, I sat absorbed in a book. Morris, watching me, wondered just how many times I needed to reread the same text to end up so consumed by it, asking if I was studying the demon bestiary again. I admitted it was really the only resource I could depend on, though the more I read, the more questions it raised, particularly who had authored it and how they gained access to such ancient records. My thoughts drifted back to a conversation with Rebecca, where I told her our next operation would present an entirely different tier of difficulty, and that intelligence on the breach at Nactum Fortress remained frustratingly thin. That was precisely why I'd asked her to weigh the mission favorably. She'd asked if I was serious, and I confirmed I was. In the present, I called Morris over, reminding him not to forget his role as a core member of this transcendent squad. As he walked off, he found himself wondering what had suddenly gotten into me. Along the way, he ran into Swan, who asked what was troubling him. He admitted that I seemed unusually fixated on the bestiary lately, while preparing for this upcoming battle. Swan pointed out that everything had gone exactly according to that book so far, and asked if he doubted its reliability. He clarified it wasn't the book he trusted, it was the commander, meaning me, and that the same trust extended to her as well. All of them, he said, placed their faith in me as their leader. Meanwhile, at Nactum Fortress, a stronghold that had once belonged to the fledgling Federation and earned the nickname the Ghostless Castle for its impenetrable defenses, the demons occupying it now had installed archbeasts for anti-air defense, fortifying it so thoroughly that soldiers had taken to calling it the graveyard for harpies. If the demons chose to simply barricade themselves inside and refuse to engage, it was uncertain whether the fortress could even be breached at all. Compounding the danger was the fortress's Bloodlands host, an entity we knew almost nothing about, the snow-white specter of Nactum Patella, with recorded accounts describing how it had wiped out thousands of civilians in a single night, and that figure only accounted for civilian casualties. The mission was perilous enough on its own, but the near-total absence of intelligence made it far more dangerous. Yet that same danger was precisely why the mission's rewards ran so high, and it would mark the true beginning of our journey as Transcendents. Back at the induction center, Scully gathered the trainees' attention, warning them there would be no wandering after lights out, and that they should handle any personal business beforehand. They all saluted in acknowledgement. Later, Asuka was walking through the backgrounds when she heard voices. Georgina and her group had cornered her, making clear they had unfinished business. Georgina sneered that she never expected to cross paths with the woman who'd ruined her family's marriage, but offered, for old time's sake, to let it go if Askal got on her knees and begged. Askal only smirked, asking if she was still stuck on that old grudge, before pointing out plainly that it had been Georgina's own sister who derailed the marriage by running off to enjoy herself on her wedding day, and questioning why the Hermes family was being blamed for someone else's poor character. This only enraged Georgina further, who declared it would be far simpler to just beat her instead. Just then, another voice cut in, Robin stepping in to stop the confrontation, warning them the instructor would be along shortly. Georgina turned on her furiously, demanding to know what she was doing out there at night, grabbing a fistful of her hair and asking if she thought civilian rules applied here. She shoved Robin hard, telling her to get lost, and Robin hit the ground with enough force to leave her shaken. That was the moment Askal's composure shattered. As Robin rose, clutching her injured face, Askal's fists clenched with fury, and she told Georgina flatly that she'd crossed a line she shouldn't have. Moments later, every member of Georgina's crew lay sprawled on the ground, beaten badly, Georgina included. Even Askal seemed startled by what she'd just done, watching as Robin calmly stepped on Georgina's face, reminding her she'd warned her to go easy, coldly informing Georgina that she'd ruined her flower crown and that she couldn't sleep without its scent nearby, asking, with quiet menace, what exactly they planned to do about it now. Other recruits came rushing in at once, startled by the commotion. Robin spotted them immediately and her whole demeanor shifted, claiming a stray attacker had ambushed them out of nowhere, while quietly warning the others that getting caught for assault would tank their scores too. Georgina lay there in disbelief at what had just happened, while Askal realized something about her friend. Even back in her early days as a singer, her delicate, feminine image had always invited this kind of trouble. It struck her that beneath that soft exterior, Robin had always been unshakably tough. Another firing drill began shortly after, and it was Robin's turn. She settled into a stance that was almost provocative, prompting some recruits to mutter that she looked more suited for a talent show than an archery range. But Scully recognized exactly what she was doing. As Robin held her position, she recalled a familiar voice instructing her to steady her anchor point, close her eyes, and listen closely for the song of the wind, an echoing, deep rhythm. With the target raised straight into the air, she shut her eyes and released the arrow slowly. It pierced the target cleanly, earning her a perfect score. As Scully reviewed the results, she noted that Robin's aim seemed slightly unsteady overall, yet she was still the only one who'd landed a perfect hit on the upper target. Checking her full name, Robin Brillet, Scully recalled rumors tied to that surname, the legendary archer and master of horizontal shooting, Holt Brillet. Realizing Robin descended directly from that bloodline, she'd assumed the lineage had died out long ago, since its unconventional combat style had fallen out of favor. She was genuinely surprised it had not only survived, but evolved even further. With that, Scully felt there was nothing more she needed to see. The weeks passed quickly, and the day of the sword-drawing ceremony arrived. Just as Scully had predicted, the two finalists selected were Trainee 17, Askal Hermes, and Trainee 12, Robin Brillet. She called Trainee 12 forward to prepare and draw. Robin stepped up, feeling the weight of the responsibility pressing down on her, uncertain whether she could truly carry it. Then Askal called out to her, telling her not to betray the transcendent spirit within her, insisting the Robin she'd always known had never been anything less than exceptional. The words reignited something in Robin, and she decided that if this truly was fate, she'd embrace it proudly. After all, she was the stunning, magnetic Robin. She walked forward, deliberately bumping into Georgina along the way, telling her to clear out unless she wanted real trouble. Then she began her warm-up. Scully gave the order for her to draw the weapon. The moment Robin's hand touched it, she poured every ounce of focus into lifting it, and, just as before, dark shadows erupted and swallowed the surrounding area. A ghostly, shadowy figure materialized before her, asking if she was the candidate chosen by the Decaphon. Studying her, it reflected that past wielders had typically carried striking, alluring figures, though it admitted a preference for her slimmer build, remarking she was almost too attractive for its taste, though it wouldn't have minded a curvier frame either. Robin fired back an insult, calling it a hideous fool. When it asked what she'd said, she quickly brushed it off as talking to herself. The creature pressed on regardless, suggesting she was simply too naive to understand her luck, warning that a single word from it could send her packing for home. But Robin had had enough, telling it to go ahead and send her back. She was thoroughly sick of this nonsense anyway, and even if it looked down on her, she had people who'd give their lives for her. The demon's tone shifted abruptly, trying to entice her instead, promising triple pay and newfound status if she simply drew the weapon. Robin remained unmoved. With no other option, the creature declared it had already granted her the weapon, but Robin, still fuming, accused it of ignoring her, insisting she wasn't finished speaking, only to realize the weapon was already resting in her grip. The revelation stunned every recruit present, Scully included. Robin Brillet, reader of the Wind's Song, was confirmed as the newest Transcendent. She struck a deliberately theatrical, fairy-like pose, musing to herself that the glamorous national idol had finally become a Transcendent. Did that mean she'd be fighting demons now? For a while at least, that wasn't quite how things played out. She found herself stuck handling menial labor meant for low-ranking soldiers instead. Even Morris found it amusing that she dived straight into grunt work the moment she arrived. Regardless, they needed to tear apart and dispose of old sandbags from a previous construction project. The pig-like soldier from earlier handed her a pin, insisting it wasn't as ordinary as it looked, claiming it was a family heirloom passed down through 7 generations of the Beckenberg line, embedded with ancient enchantments, functioning as a universal key capable of opening any emergency exit. Meanwhile, the dark elf spotted Robin and felt a flicker of recognition. I mentioned to her that Robin had once toured the continent as a performer, once the face of the younger elven generation. The dark elf was stunned to be standing before her in person, noting she seemed far more down-to-earth than the rumors suggested, though privately she couldn't help thinking Robin was strikingly attractive. Her eyes looked somewhat distant, yet in her own mind, the elf found Robin's presence almost overwhelming, a devastatingly gorgeous figure paired with real menace beneath it. Even Swan and Scully, watching from a distance, agreed she was exactly the type Jarrah would despise instantly. They braced themselves for the inevitable friction Jarrah would cause, though they resolved to support Robin as best they could. Still, neither Scully nor Swan had any idea just how capable this new, fiercer version of Robin would prove to be when facing off against Jarrah. Elsewhere, Jarrah asked the spear-wielding soldier why Rebecca and Moai were causing such a commotion over at the administration office, wondering if something serious was unfolding, and told him to go find out. He headed to the admin block, and after a while came rushing back to the mess hall declaring it was an emergency. Rebecca asked what was going on, and he explained that the high-ranking soldiers were returning from leave that very night. The news alarmed both her and Jarrah, with Rebecca questioning whether they weren't supposed to be stationed at the southeastern front instead, abandoning their post here. The giant reminded her that word had spread the central front was proving too brutal, prompting the senior officers to retreat toward the flanks instead, a claim he confirmed, adding that while most of the high-ranking soldiers had scattered back to their posts, 2 of them had actually volunteered to be deployed straight to the central front. The word volunteered caught everyone off guard, leaving them to wonder if these 2 had lost their minds. Jarrah demanded to know who exactly these 2 were. At that very moment, elsewhere, 2 soldiers sat playing cards, having just returned from leave, Ulti and Jarrah.